Hello everyone, I am Mr. Brian. I know many of you enjoy listening to these videos as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment, letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Alright, now let's get comfortable, relax, and dive into tonight's case. Story 1. On February 24, 2023, at approximately 7:40 a.m., a 911 call comes in from a home in Herndon, Virginia. The dispatcher hears only muffled moans before the line cuts off. 15 minutes later, another call. A man claims he shot an intruder attacking his wife. When officers arrive, they find a horrific scene. A woman stabbed multiple times, and a man dead from 2 gunshots. What begins as a case of home invasion suddenly turns into a web of deceit, manipulation, and murder. Hi, I'm Mark, and welcome to True Crime Stories. Today we're looking at the case of Juliana Perez Megales and the Banfield family, a case of betrayal, manipulation, and murder, where investigators uncovered forensic evidence, digital footprints, and personal connections that raised more questions than answers. Why would a husband conspire with a family nanny to kill his own wife, the mother of his daughter? Who is the intruder, and what did he do to deserve to die? The deeper they dug into the lives of those involved, the more complicated the story became. Let's take a look. Juliana Perez Megales was born in Brazil and raised by her mother, who worked as a house cleaner. At age 21, she moved to Virginia as part of a cultural exchange program. This program allowed her to work as an au pair, providing childcare and cultural exchange with an American family. In late 2021, Juliana began her employment with Brendan and Christine Banfield as a live-in nanny. Her responsibilities included caring for the couple's young daughter and assisting with household duties. As she settled into a role, Brendan started taking interest in her, and over time, their relationship would go on to extend beyond professional boundaries. This development would later play a crucial role in the events that unfolded. Brendan Banfield was born in February 1985 and has worked as an IRS agent since 2009. His role involved significant responsibilities, including handling of sensitive financial investigations. Christine Banfield, born in September 1985, was employed as a pediatric ICU nurse, a position that required extensive medical knowledge and emotional resilience. The couple had one daughter born in 2018, who was the focus on their family life. In 2019, Brendan and Christine moved from Long Island, New York, Herndon, Virginia. They purchased a 5-bedroom home for $79,000, which provided ample space for their growing family. The Banfields' decision to relocate and invest in a larger home reflected their commitment to establishing a stable environment for their daughter. On February 24, 2023, at 7:47 a.m., the first 911 call was placed from the Banfield residence in Herndon, Virginia. The call was made by Juliana, but communication was unclear. The dispatcher could only hear moaning on the line before the call abruptly ended. Just 15 minutes later, at 8:02 a.m., a second call was made. This time, Juliana requested assistance, and Brendan Banfield came onto the line, claiming he had shot an intruder who attacked his wife. When the police arrived at the scene, they discovered Christine Banfield, age 37, in the master bedroom. She had sustained multiple stab wounds to her upper body. Not far from her, Joseph Ryan, age 38, was found dead from gunshot wounds, one to the head and one to the chest. Christine was transported to a hospital in the hope that her life could be saved. However, shortly after arriving at the hospital, she was pronounced dead. Joseph Ryan was already pronounced dead at the scene. Following the tragic events of February 24, 2023, investigators began to scrutinize Juliana's account of the morning. Juliana claimed that she had left the Banfield residence shortly after Brendan departed for work, intending to take the couple's daughter of 4 years to the National Zoo. However, she stated that she returned home after realizing she had forgotten the packed lunches in the refrigerator. This narrative raised suspicions among detectives due to its timing and the circumstances surrounding her return. As Juliana approached the house, she observed an unfamiliar vehicle parked in the driveway and saw a man entering the home carrying a bag. This observation was pivotal. It indicated that someone unexpected was inside the residence at the time. Juliana attempted to contact Christine Banfield, but received no answer. She then called Brendan to inform him of her observations, prompting him to return home. Upon Brendan's arrival, he and Juliana entered the house together with their daughter. Juliana placed the child in the basement for safety before following Brendan upstairs. When they reached the master bedroom, they discovered Joseph Ryan leaning over Christina Banfield, holding a knife to her throat. This alarming scene led Brendan to draw his service weapon and shoot Joseph Ryan once in the head. After this initial shot, Brendan instructed Juliana to retrieve a Glock semi-automatic pistol from a gun safe in the bathroom. Juliana complied and fired a single shot at Joseph Ryan, claiming uncertainty about whether she hit him. However, forensic evidence later confirmed that her shot did strike him in the chest. The conflicting accounts provided by both Juliana and Brendan raised significant doubts among investigators. Their narratives contained inconsistencies regarding their actions and observations during critical moments leading up to the shooting. As the detectives got deeper into these discrepancies, they began to question the authenticity of their claims, setting the stage for further investigation into the events that morning. One important question that needed answering was who was the intruder Joseph Ryan, and what was his purpose for visiting the Banfield residence. So investigators on the case started digging up information to find any links between the two parties. What they found out as a result of the investigation made the entire case more complex. Joseph Ryan was an active user of FetLife, an online BDSM community. He would often utilize this platform to connect with others who shared similar interests. Under the surname Taco Supreme 7000, he engaged in various discussions, sharing his experiences and preferences related to kink and alternative sexual lifestyles. His profile indicated a willingness to explore unconventional relationships, which was a significant aspect of his life. Investigators later uncovered that Ryan had been communicating with a user named Anastasia9, a profile that featured Christine Banfield's photo as the profile picture. This interaction would prove critical to understanding the events leading up to the tragic incident at the Banfield residence. The messages exchanged between Ryan and Anastasia9 suggested he was lured into a situation under false pretenses. Ryan believed he was meeting Christine Banfield for a consensual encounter, but evidence indicated that this was not the case. The profile of Anastasia9 was maintained on Christine Banfield's computer, which raised immediate red flags for investigators. Investigators had to first make sure whether it was Christine operating this profile, or was it someone impersonating her. They decided to match the content to the conversations between Ryan and Anastasia. To everyone's shock, they found out that the content of the messages exchanged between Ryan and his impersonated profile was inconsistent with Christine's typical writing style. This discrepancy suggested that someone had deliberately crafted these communications to mislead Ryan into believing he was engaged with Christine. The impersonation played a crucial role in the investigation, as it indicated a predetermined effort to lure Ryan into the Banfield home. The messages contained details that would have made them appear authentic to Ryan, further complicating the narrative surrounding his presence in the house on February 24, 2023. As detectives pieced together this information, it became clear that Joseph Ryan had been manipulated into a dangerous situation, believing he was meeting someone he trusted. This revelation not only highlighted the complexity of the case, but also raised questions about the motives behind the impersonation and how it fit into the larger context of events leading to the double homicide. As investigators got deeper into the case, they uncovered startling forensic evidence that significantly altered the trajectory of the investigation. One of the most flabbergasting findings was the manipulation of blood at the crime scene. Analysis revealed that blood from Christine Banfield's body had been deliberately smeared onto Joseph Ryan's body after his death. This act suggested an attempt to frame Ryan as the attacker, complicating the narrative surrounding the events of February 24, 2023. The implications of this evidence were profound. It indicated that someone had gone to great lengths to create a false narrative regarding the circumstances of Ryan's presence in the Banfield home. The forensic team examined blood spatter patterns and conducted DNA analysis, which confirmed the origin of the blood found on Ryan. First, the fake social media profile with Christine's picture, and then the blatant tampering of evidence and an attempt to frame Ryan by smearing Christina's blood on him. The investigators realized the story was much more complicated than what it was made to look like. All guns pointed toward Juliana and Brendan, both of whom claimed their actions were in self-defense and nothing else. After several months of investigation that could only complicate the case, the law enforcement service's needle fell on Juliana in October. She was arrested and charged with second-degree murder and use of a firearm in connection with the death of Joseph Ryan. The decision to charge Juliana stemmed from a combination of evidence and her role in the events of February 24th. Investigators noted that she was present at the scene during the critical moments leading up to Ryan's death and provided conflicting accounts of her actions that morning. Juliana's narrative, which included her claim of leaving to take the Banfield's daughter to the zoo and returning for forgotten lunches, raised suspicions among detectives. They found inconsistencies in her story that did not align with the physical evidence collected at the crime scene. Additionally, forensic analysis and the deliberate attempt to frame Ryan using Christine's blood all but sealed the deal for Juliana. The arrest unfolded on October 15, 2023, when law enforcement officials arrived at Juliana's residence. She was taken into custody without incident. During her arrest, officers explained the charges against her and informed her of her rights. Juliana maintained her innocence throughout this process, asserting that she acted out of fear for her life and believed she was defending herself and Christina Banfield from an intruder. Following her arrest, Juliana was transported to a local detention facility where she awaited processing. Her initial court appearance was scheduled shortly after her arrest. During this hearing, prosecutors presented evidence that included the same forensic findings and details of her communications on the day of the incident. As legal proceedings began, prosecutors argued that Juliana's actions demonstrated a reckless disregard for human life. They contended that she had played an active role in escalating a situation that ultimately resulted in violence. The case against her continued to develop as investigators worked to gather additional evidence while preparing for trial. If you're wondering why Brendan was not arrested, here is an explanation. Law enforcement officials saw Brendan's shooting of Joseph Ryan as protective. As per Brendan's claims, he was threatened by Ryan the intruder, and if he had not acted as fast as he did, Ryan would have killed his wife with the knife he had around her neck. However, Juliana's deliberate attempt to shoot Ryan after he had already been shot by Brendan was seen as a second-degree murder. Once Juliana was arrested, the focus shifted to Brendan Banfield, but there was a lack of evidence to build a case against him. But the investigators did not give up. What they found out next was shockingly devastating. In August 2022, Juliana Perez McCulloch moved into the Banfield home as a live-in nanny. This arrangement marked the beginning of an affair between her and Brendan Banfield. The dynamic of their relationship evolved quickly, as both individuals found themselves drawn to each other amidst the responsibilities of family life. Fast forward to October 2023, when investigators began uncovering evidence of this affair during their ongoing inquiry into the events surrounding the deaths of Joseph Ryan and Christine Banfield. The discovery of the relationship raised significant suspicions regarding potential motives behind the murders, suggesting that personal interests may have influenced the actions taken that fateful day. During a search of Brendan's bedroom, law enforcement officials found several notable findings that further implicated him in the unfolding narrative. Among these discoveries were framed photos of Brendan and Juliana, including a personal connection that went beyond professional boundaries. Additionally, Juliana's lingerie was found in the room, serving as tangible evidence of their intimate relationship. The combination of these findings not only painted a picture of an illicit relationship, but also provided investigators with critical evidence to build a case against Brendan. The implications of this affair became increasingly significant as authorities pieced together the timeline and circumstances surrounding the murders. The relationship between Juliana and Brendan was no longer just a personal matter. It had transformed into a central element of the investigation, influencing how detectives approached their inquiries and shaping the narrative surrounding both individuals' actions on 24 February 2023. In mid-February 2023, just weeks before the tragic events of February 24, Brendan Banfield made a significant decision to purchase a Glock pistol from a shooting range. This transaction raised immediate red flags for investigators, especially given the timing and the subsequent homicides that unfolded shortly thereafter. The purchase of a firearm just before such a violent incident suggested potential premeditation, leading authorities to scrutinize Brendan's actions more closely. Additionally, it was revealed that both Brendan and Juliana had traded in their phones for new models shortly before the incident. This change in communication devices sparked further suspicion among investigators. The timing of these trades occurring just days before the murders indicated a possible attempt to eliminate evidence or communication records that could link them to premeditated actions leading up to the incident. Investigators began to question whether these actions were part of a larger plan involving both Juliana and Brendan, as they sought to establish a cleaner timeline of events leading up to the confrontation with Joseph Ryan. Even after finding substantial evidence against Brendan Banfield, the law enforcement authorities needed more. Hence, following Juliana's arrest, law enforcement officials implemented a strategy to monitor her communications while she was incarcerated. This included tapping phone calls between Juliana and Brendan, common investigation technique used in high-profile cases where the relationship between suspects could yield crucial evidence. The decision to tap these calls was driven by the need to gather information that could clarify the dynamics of their relationship and any potential premeditated actions related to the murders of Christine Banfield and Joseph Ryan. In a recorded call from jail Deputy Commonwealth's Attorney Eric Klingon, revealed during a bond hearing that Juliana expressed concern about their relationship. She told Brendan, "I hope you are not just staying with me because you are afraid of me turning against you." This statement indicated her awareness of the precarious situation they were both in, and suggested that she was contemplating the implications of their actions on that fateful day. Brendan's response during this phone call was equally telling. He allegedly instructed her to keep her mouth shut on the recorded phone line. This directive all but put the last nail in Brendan's coffin. He was clearly attempting to control the narrative and prevent Juliana from divulging information that could implicate him in the crimes. Finally, the time came. In September 2024, when Brendan Banfield was arrested by law enforcement authorities, following an extensive 11-month-long investigation into the events surrounding the deaths of Joseph Ryan and Christine Banfield. The arrest took place after detectives gathered substantial evidence linking Brendan to the crimes, including forensic findings, inconsistencies in his statements, and more. Law enforcement apprehended Brendan at his residence without incident. He would face serious legal repercussions following his arrest in September 2024. The primary charges brought against him were aggravated murder and the use of a firearm in the commission of a felony. The charge of aggravated murder stemmed from the circumstances surrounding the death of Joseph Ryan, who was shot in the Banfield home on February 24. Prosecutors argued that Brendan's actions demonstrated a reckless disregard for human life and indicated premeditation, as he allegedly orchestrated the events that led to the confrontation with Ryan. Additionally, Brendan was charged with using a firearm in the commission of a felony, specifically related to the use of his service weapon during the incident. This charge highlighted the severity of the crime, as it involved not only the unlawful taking of another person's life, but also the use of a firearm, which escalated the nature of the offense. When it came to the prosecution's case against Brendan, they had covered every little bit of the loopholes. After all, they had spent 11 months preparing a case against him. They presented some key inconsistencies in his account of the 24th of February 2023. The first thing they brought up was Brendan's time and actions on that day. He left his house around 7:10 a.m., but did not proceed to work as scheduled. Instead, he parked at a McDonald's restaurant and remained in his vehicle, seemingly waiting for a call from Juliana. This suggested that he may have been anticipating the unfolding events rather than heading to his job. Then there was the peculiar question of 2 911 calls. Both were placed approximately 15 minutes apart. During the first call, the dispatcher heard nothing but moaning, but never did Juliana mention she was hurt during the entire confrontation or in immediate danger. So why was the first call blank? Only after 15 minutes of the first call did Juliana ask for help from the authorities. If the situation was this dire as they presented it, why was it not reported immediately? Maybe because they had not yet finished the job of putting both victims away. Another key mistake made by Brendan, which the prosecution picked up on, was the retrieving of a second weapon. After shooting Joseph Ryan and blinding him, according to Juliana, Brendan asked her to retrieve a Glock semi-automatic pistol from a gun safe in the bathroom. This request was puzzling. If Joseph posed an immediate threat after being shot in the head, why would Brendan need Juliana to shoot him again? This inconsistency suggested a lack of urgency in their supposed self-defense scenario. Why do you think Brendan asked Juliana to shoot Ryan with a second gun? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Hence, it was the prosecution who firmly contended that Brendan Banfield was not merely a bystander in the tragic events of February 24, 2023, but rather an active participant in a calculated plan that ultimately led to the death of Joseph Ryan. Investigators uncovered evidence suggesting that Brendan was the one who orchestrated the impersonation of Christine on the fetish website FetLife. This profile, created under the name Anastasia9, was first used by Brendan himself, and then he instructed Juliana to use it in order to lure Joseph Ryan to the Banfield home under false pretenses. The prosecution argued that this act demonstrated Brendan's willingness to engage in deceitful tactics to achieve his goals. There was also a clear motive and evidence linking him directly to his wife's murder. Testimonies indicated that he had expressed a desire to be rid of her shortly after beginning his affair with Juliana. This desire for freedom from marriage was framed as a driving force behind his actions on that fateful day. Once the deed was done, he would make a failed attempt at tampering with the evidence by smearing Christina's blood on Ryan in order to frame him when he was the one to have orchestrated the entire plan. In April 2024, a new significant development occurred in the case when the arrest suspect Juliana entered a plea agreement. Following her arrest, Juliana faced charges of second-degree murder and use of a firearm in connection with Joseph Ryan's death. As the investigation progressed, the evidence against her mounted, prompting discussions about a potential plea deal. The details of the plea agreement included a change of charges against her. Juliana pleaded guilty to voluntary manslaughter, a lesser charge than the original second-degree murder charge she faced. This decision was part of a negotiated plea agreement with prosecutors. The plea deal was negotiated between Juliana's defense attorney and the prosecution. This process involved discussions about the evidence against her potential sentencing outcomes and any cooperation she might provide regarding Brendan Banfield or other aspects of the case. By pleading to a lesser charge, Juliana aimed to reduce her potential sentence compared to what she might have faced if convicted of second-degree murder. This strategic move was intended to mitigate her legal consequences. The turning point in the plea agreement came when Juliana agreed to cooperate with law enforcement, providing information about Brendan and other relevant details related to the case, especially what transpired on the day of the murders. This cooperation was beneficial for both parties, offering Juliana a more favorable outcome while assisting prosecutors in building their case against Brendan. October 29, 2024, was the day when months and months of negotiations between the two parties came to an end, and Juliana agreed to cooperate with the authorities. As for her new sentence details, she could face 10 years but may be released with credit for time served. Do you think it was the right decision for her to take up the plea agreement, or should she have fought the case? Drop your thoughts in the comment section below. As the legal proceedings continue, significant upcoming trials are on the horizon for both Juliana Perez Morales and Brendan Banfield. Juliana's sentencing is set for March 25, where she faces up to 10 years in prison potentially, with time served considered. Meanwhile, Brendan's trial is scheduled for February 3, 2025, as he confronts serious charges of aggravated murder and the use of a firearm in the commission of a felony, which could result in life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The complexities of the case remain under scrutiny, as ongoing investigations may uncover further details about the events leading up to the tragic deaths of Joseph Ryan and Christine Banfield. Both defendants' legal statuses are critical as they navigate their respective charges and prepare for what lies ahead in the courtroom. The outcomes of these trials will be pivotal in determining justice for all parties involved as the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Story 2. Fino. In January of 1980, a family of 4 returned home after a long day filled with special moments. But for this family, tomorrow would never come. Teresa Gilligan, a devoted wife and mother of 2, spent her final moments not screaming, not pleading, but comforting her terrified children in front of their cold-blooded killer. And within minutes, the entire family would endure the most unimaginable horror, one so brutal it defies comprehension. What's especially frustrating about this case is that the killer became more well-known than the innocent family he destroyed, and that just doesn't sit right. So today we're diving deep not to glorify the crime, but to bring the victims back into the story where they belong. While justice may have been served, it would take 25 years before the remaining family could finally sleep in peace. And once you hear the full story, you'll understand exactly why. For this case, let's travel all the way to Evansville, Indiana, where the Gilligan family built their lives in the late 70s. By all accounts, they were the definition of a loving all-American family. Patrick, the father, and Teresa, the mother, were both 30 years old in 1980. Together, they were raising their two young children, Lisa, 5, and Gregory, for in what seemed like a simple, happy life. Now, as mentioned earlier, there's not a lot of information about them online, but what we do know was that Patrick worked as a warehouse manager at L.B. Jones Furniture Company, providing a steady paycheck to keep the family comfortable. Teresa, on the other hand, dedicated herself to making their house feel like a home, warm, safe, and full of love. She made sure Lisa and Gregory had everything they needed, from bedtime stories to home-cooked meals, creating the kind of childhood every kid deserves. Back in those days, Evansville was a growing city with about 13,000 people calling it home. It was an industrial hotspot with factories and manufacturing jobs, keeping the economy strong. Most neighborhoods had that close-knit, small-town feel, where neighbors actually knew each other. Kids played outside until the street lights flickered on, and families came together for community events. And the Gilligans were no different. They were active in their church, well-liked by their neighbors, and had a reputation for being kind, hard-working, and devoted to their family. Additionally, Teresa was involved in her community. She once chaired meetings for the Indiana Association of Legal Secretaries, and even led an astrology-themed talk called Age of Aquarius. Patrick, on the other hand, had been a star athlete in his younger years, even setting a discus record at Wake Forest before settling into a stable job in Evansville. But beyond their community roles, what really stood out about the Gilligans was how well they raised their kids. Lisa and Gregory were always dressed neatly, polite, and well-behaved, traits that didn't go unnoticed. Teachers, neighbors, and even family members often spoke about how much love and care Teresa and Patrick put into raising their kids. And unlike those picture-perfect families that sometimes turned out to be a mess behind closed doors, the Gilligans were exactly who they appeared to be, genuinely happy. There were no rumors of affairs, no marital fights, no dark secrets lurking in the background. In fact, just 2 days before the unthinkable happened, Teresa told her mother that she and Patrick were incredibly lucky. In her own words, she said, "There are so few people who ever find the kind of love we had." And just like so many true crime cases, tragedy struck when the family least expected it. It was January 14, 1980, and Patrick had the day off from work. Days off were special for the Gilligans. They usually planned something fun for the whole family, and that day was no different. Lisa and Gregory had recently received Christmas money, so Patrick and Teresa took them out to spend it on whatever they wanted. It was one of those simple but cherished moments, a regular family outing, just parents letting their kids pick out toys or treats, something small that would make them smile. After finishing their shopping, they stopped by the children's grandparents' house for a quick visit before heading home. It was around 8 in the evening when they pulled into their driveway. Their house sat in a quiet suburban neighborhood on Aspen Drive, the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where crime was a rarity, and where safety was something everyone took for granted. That night, Teresa and her children were the first to step inside, while Patrick stayed behind in the garage. But what they didn't know was that a man with a gun was already waiting for them. Before Teresa could even process what was happening, the intruder aimed his gun at her and ordered her to stay quiet. Her heart must have pounded in her chest, but with her two small children right there, she had no choice but to comply. The stranger forced them to sit down, his weapon a silent threat that he was in control. Then, using whatever he could find around the house, a vacuum cleaner cord among other household items, he tied up Teresa, Lisa, and Gregory. Just as he was finishing, Patrick walked through the door. For a split second, maybe he was confused. Maybe he thought it was a prank, a misunderstanding. But then he saw his wife and kids bound and terrified, and standing in front of them, a man with a gun. Patrick did what any loving father and husband would. He tried to reason with the intruder, hoping to defuse the situation and keep his family safe. But the man wasn't interested in talking. He forced Patrick to the ground at gunpoint, tying him up just like Teresa and the kids. And then, in a twisted attempt to keep them calm, or maybe just toying with their fear, he assured them that he wasn't going to hurt anyone, that this was just a robbery, that once he got what he wanted, he'd be on his way. But as the case later revealed, that was never how things were going to end. The killer would later admit that he never intended to kill the Gilligan family. But that shifted when Patrick saw an opportunity to fight back. As he rummaged through the house looking for valuables, Patrick managed to loosen his restraints. Fueled by sheer desperation to protect his family, he lunged at the intruder, hoping to overpower him. But that attempt failed. Because of this, the intruder now had what he believed was a reason to eliminate the entire family. In a split second, he pulled the trigger and shot Patrick. But Patrick didn't die immediately. He was still alive, struggling to hold on. The intruder, however, couldn't take any chances. He grabbed a dumbbell lying nearby and mercilessly struck Patrick again and again, making sure he wouldn't get back up. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Imagine the sheer horror Teresa and the children must have felt in that moment, watching their husband and father being beaten to death right in front of them. It was a nightmare they never could have prepared for. The children must have been terrified, beyond words, clinging to their mother, hoping for some kind of protection. And Teresa, despite witnessing something so horrific, stayed as composed as she could for them. Reports suggest that even after watching her husband's brutal death, she remained calm, likely trying to shield her children emotionally, if not physically. But none of it mattered. The intruder had already made his decision. Whether it was fear of being caught or something far darker, he wasn't going to leave any witnesses behind. In cold blood, he raised his gun once again, and one by one shot Teresa, Lisa, and Gregory, silencing the Gilligan family forever. Now, as it turns out, the Gilligan home wasn't the only target that night. The intruder had struck more than once. Later that evening, around 10:15 p.m., a call came in from a concerned neighbor, Ralph Hendricks, who had just returned home to find his house burglarized. In response, Indiana State Trooper Thomas Snyder was dispatched to Aspen Drive. Following standard procedure, Snyder began checking with nearby residents to see if anyone had seen or heard anything unusual. One of the houses he approached was the Gilligan residence, which was right next door to Hendricks. He knocked on the front door, but obviously no one responded. Suspecting that this house might have been burglarized as well, he walked around to the back and immediately noticed something alarming. The window on the door had been taped and broken through, likely an attempt to muffle the sound of forced entry. His instincts kicked in, and realizing something was seriously wrong, Snyder decided to enter the home for a welfare check. What he initially assumed was another case of burglary quickly turned into a horrifying discovery, a gruesome quadruple homicide. Investigators arrived at the scene, and it quickly became evident that this was a burglary gone horribly wrong. Teresa's purse was found sitting on a chair, its contents rummaged through a clear indication that the intruder had been searching for valuables. Nearby, a shattered gun case lay on the floor, its glass broken, and all the firearms inside had been stolen. But what stood out the most was the state of the entire house. It was in complete disarray, every room turned upside down. Given that a neighbor's house had also been burglarized that same night, it became obvious that the crime spree had escalated into a horrifying tragedy. Naturally, the neighborhood was gripped with fear. Crimes like this simply didn't happen here, and the idea that someone could commit such brutal acts right in their own backyard was terrifying. People locked their doors, watched their streets more closely, and whispered in hushed voices about what had happened. But then investigators caught a break. A neighbor recalled seeing a suspicious car lingering around the area the day before the murders. It was described as a light blue four-door Plymouth, old, dented, and in poor condition. In a well-maintained neighborhood, where unfamiliar cars stood out, this vehicle immediately seemed out of place. Police wasted no time in reaching out to nearby law enforcement agencies, asking for any reports of burglaries in the area, specifically those involving taped windows. Almost immediately, detectives came forward with a lead. Two names that had repeatedly surfaced in connection with similar crimes, Richard Milligan and Donald Wallace Jr., were well-known associates with extensive criminal records. Both were habitual drug users who frequently resorted to breaking into homes to fund their addictions. Their history of burglary made them prime suspects in the Gilligan case. As investigators dug deeper, they uncovered a key piece of information. Richard Milligan was known to own a blue Plymouth, the same car a neighbor had seen near the crime scene. Determined to track him down, police set up surveillance at his last known address, hoping the vehicle would eventually turn up. Hours passed as officers remained on high alert, watching and waiting. Then their patience paid off. The blue Plymouth finally pulled up, and police wasted no time moving in. However, when they approached the vehicle, they were met with an unexpected twist. The driver was neither Richard Milligan nor Donald Wallace Jr. Instead, it was a woman. The woman identified herself as Debbie Durham and explained that Richard had let her borrow the car. As police questioned her, they conducted a search of the vehicle, and what they found only deepened their suspicions. Inside, they uncovered a gun, along with various stolen items that had been reported missing from the Hendricks home. This immediately tied the car, and by extension Debbie, to at least one of the burglaries in the area. She was promptly arrested and taken to the station for further questioning about Richard's whereabouts. While investigators weren't entirely convinced that Debbie was responsible for the crime, they also couldn't rule her out. At the very least, she was their strongest link to Richard Milligan. Under interrogation, Debbie insisted she had nothing to do with the Gilligan family murders. In fact, she claimed that Richard couldn't have been involved either, because he was already in jail at the time of the killings. This revelation changed everything. If Richard was locked up, that left only one other suspect, Donald Wallace Jr. Now Donald Wallace Jr. was no ordinary criminal. Recently released from prison, he was the boyfriend of Debbie Durham and had a reputation that set him apart from the average crook. With an intelligence quotient of 130, Donald was known to use his intelligence to his advantage, manipulating situations to benefit himself. But despite his sharp mind, his life was defined by instability, crime, and a deep sense of resentment. His troubled childhood played a significant role in shaping the man he became. Born to teenage parents who divorced when he was just 5, Donald described his upbringing as loveless and insecure. After his mother left him in the care of his father, who showed little interest in raising him, his downward spiral began. By the age of 11, he was living at the Evansville Psychiatric Children's Center, the first of many institutions he would pass through over the next 10 years. At just 14, he was already deeply involved in crime, bouncing in and out of juvenile detention. There, he quickly learned that violence earned him respect, a lesson he would carry with him into adulthood. Before the Gilligan murders, Donald was mostly a petty criminal, committing burglaries to support his drug addiction. At first was unwilling to provide any information about Donald. However, when police showed her the crime scene photos, her disbelief quickly turned to shock. She couldn't fathom that he was capable of such horrific actions, and that's when she finally started talking. Unfortunately, she had no idea where he was. The last time she saw him was the night before, when he stopped by her mother's house. With this lead, investigators went to question Debbie's mother. She confirmed that between 7 and 9 in the evening, Donald had arrived in a blue car. According to her, he was acting erratically, carrying a jacket draped over his shoulder. Once inside, he laid out an assortment of items for Debbie to see: several guns, including a .38 caliber on his hip, the same caliber used in the murders, along with stacks of money, various pieces of jewelry, and miscellaneous valuables, including a camera. These items were later linked to the burglaries at both the Hendricks and Gilligan homes. Shockingly, Donald had Debbie's brother take pictures of him posing with the stolen items, eager to flaunt his crimes to his friends. But his actions didn't stop there. Debbie's sister recalled that after his impromptu photo session, Donald went outside and started a fire. When the family stepped out to investigate, they saw him burning a series of items, including the very jacket he had carried in earlier. A neighbor also reported seeing a man with shoulder-length hair standing by the fire. Acting on this information, an officer searched the area and discovered remnants of the burned jacket. Beneath the charred fabric, he found something even more incriminating: a set of wedding rings with missing stones and several pieces of glass, further tying Donald Wallace Jr. to the brutal crime spree. Debbie also handed over several items belonging to Donald: a pair of jeans, a ring, and a glove. The jeans were the same ones he had worn on the night of the Gilligan murders. When tested by a serologist, the fabric revealed traces of type AB human blood. This was damning evidence, because Donald's blood type was O, while Teresa Gilligan and one of her children had type AB. The ring Debbie surrendered was another key piece of evidence. Donald had claimed it came from a jeweler, but in reality, it belonged to Teresa Gilligan. Teresa's mother identified it immediately, and further confirmation came from a jeweler who had resized the ring. The jeweler had kept a record of all the pieces his shop worked on, including photographs proving without a doubt that the ring was Teresa's. The glove Debbie provided was also tested and found to be stained with type B blood, the same blood type as Patrick Gilligan. With this overwhelming stack of evidence, it was clear that Donald Wallace Jr. was responsible for the brutal killings. An area-wide manhunt was launched, with Donald's name and face plastered all over the news. For a full day, police searched relentlessly. Then on January 15th, they received a tip that he had been spotted in Newburgh, Indiana, where he was hiding out with friends. However, by the time police arrived, Donald had already vanished. His friends confirmed that he had been there, but had left supposedly on a mission to find Debbie. According to them, Donald was well aware that he was a wanted man and needed to confirm whether Debbie had been arrested. Beyond that, no one knew his current whereabouts, and there was a growing sense of fear. With his violent past and the severity of his crimes, everyone understood just how dangerous Donald Wallace Jr. truly was. After a long and exhausting day of chasing false leads, the police were preparing to leave on the night of January 15th, when the phone rang once more. This time, it was a local coach named Bob Ashworth. Bob explained that he had been out walking his dog when he noticed a suspicious figure climbing up into the attic of a nearby house. Given the number of misleading tips they had already received that day, the officers were skeptical. However, something about Bob's tone convinced them to check it out. Upon arriving at the location, they met with Bob, who pointed out the house in question. The officers knocked on the door, and an elderly woman answered. She seemed surprised but listened attentively as they explained the situation. She insisted that she had been home all day and was certain no one had entered her attic. Still, she welcomed them inside and granted them permission to check. The officers called up into the attic, but there was no response. As they cautiously climbed the stairs, one of them chambered around into their shotgun. The distinct sound echoed through the small space, and suddenly a voice called out from the darkness, "Don't shoot, I'm coming down." A man slowly emerged from the shadows, his hands raised. When asked for his name, he hesitated before answering, "Richard Milligan," but the officers knew better. The man standing before them was none other than Donald Wallace. Without hesitation, they arrested him on the spot. Donald later admitted that if he had known they recognized him, the encounter might have ended very differently. At just 22 years old, Donald Wallace Jr. was officially charged with 4 counts of murder. However, before he could stand trial, he was declared incompetent and spent the next 2 years in a mental hospital. In May of 1980, 2 psychiatrists testified that he suffered from acute paranoid schizophrenia. But in 1982, during his competency trial, witnesses and evidence painted a different picture, one that suggested he had been faking his illness all along. With that, his trial was set. Donald never admitted to the killings. He insisted that he had only been there to rob the house, and that an unknown accomplice was responsible for the brutal slayings. But no one believed his story. Even during his trial, he stuck to the same weak defense, but the evidence was insurmountable. On October 24, 1982, Donald Wallace Jr. was sentenced to death. Despite maintaining his innocence publicly, Donald had a different version of events in private. In a letter to Teresa Gilligan's sister, he finally confessed. According to him, he had been gathering random household items when he heard the garage door open. He panicked. Trapped with no escape route, he grabbed his gun and took control of the situation, holding the family at gunpoint and tying them up. Then, in a sudden and terrifying moment, Patrick Gilligan broke free. Donald shot him immediately. And then, in his own words, the killings happened so fast he barely knew what was happening. He claimed that after killing Patrick, he realized he couldn't leave witnesses behind, so he turned the gun on Teresa. And then, in what might be the most heart-wrenching part of his confession, he said he couldn't bear the thought of the children growing up with the trauma of losing their parents, so he took their lives as well. In the years leading up to his execution, Donald fought tooth and nail to delay the inevitable. He filed every possible appeal, went on hunger strikes, and explored every legal loophole he could find. But eventually, he realized he was out of options. Just days before his execution, he publicly admitted to the murders, something he had avoided doing for over 2 decades. In a series of letters, he expressed remorse. He wrote that he was no longer the deranged dope fiend he once was claiming, that at the time he had no moral compass and no real sense of what he had done. He wanted the world to know that he was sorry, that if he could take it back, he would, but he knew that was impossible. Donald's lawyer had planned to submit a 48-page clemency request in a last-ditch effort to save his life. But in his final days, Donald refused. He instructed his lawyer not to file it, waiving his right to ask the governor for mercy. "I'm ready to die," he said. After 23 years of fighting, he had made peace with his fate. "The dying part is easy," he added. "I'm so tired of doing time." On March 9, 2005, at the Indiana State Prison, Donald Wallace Jr. had his last meal: steak, baked potato soup, and chocolate truffle cake. He declined a spiritual advisor and spent his final hours meeting with a few visitors before being transferred to a holding cell. At exactly 12:23 a.m., Donald Wallace Jr. was executed by lethal injection. His final words were simple: "I hope everyone can find peace with this." That same day, Teresa's sister Diana Harrington held a vigil not for Donald, but for the victims. She had spent years ensuring that the memory of her sister, brother-in-law, and their children would not be overshadowed by the man who took their lives. She continued that mission in 2007, when she and her husband Ted published a book titled Surviving the Death Penalty, a deeply personal account of the crime and the long-lasting effects it had on their family. Over the years, Donald Wallace became infamous, not just for the brutal nature of his crime, but also for the drawn-out legal battle that followed. However, if he hadn't stolen the lives of the Gilligan family, they would still be here today, living out the future they deserved. By now, Teresa and Patrick would likely be proud grandparents, watching their children raise families of their own. Their kids would have grown into adults, building lives filled with love, memories, and milestones. But instead, their story was cut short in the most tragic way imaginable. And while Donald Wallace is no longer alive, his execution could never truly erase the pain left behind that night. The pain of a family torn apart, the grief of those who loved them, and the lasting impact of such a senseless crime. Story 3 said, "Mom, you better close the doors." And I said, "What happened?" And he said, "There was a murder in Keddie." And I said, "Keddie?" A remote cabin, a brutal crime, a case that has haunted investigators for over 4 decades. What really happened inside Cabin 28 in Keddie, California, on that fateful night in April 1981. Join us as we unravel one of America's most chilling murders, the Keddie murders. Nestled deep in the Sierra Nevada mountains, Keddie, California, was the kind of quiet, tucked-away town where people came to start over. It was a place where towering pines lined narrow roads, where cabins stood in clusters like relics of a simpler time. In the early 1980s, Keddie wasn't much more than a former railroad town trying to stay afloat. It was small, isolated, and for the most part peaceful. For 36-year-old Glenna Sue Sharp, this remote town seemed like the perfect place to rebuild. She had recently left her troubled marriage behind, seeking a fresh start for herself and her 5 children. Though money was tight, was determined to give her kids a better life. They moved into Cabin 28, a modest rental in the Keddie Resort, where other struggling families had also made their home. By all accounts, the Sharps were a normal family. The kids made friends. Sue worked hard to make ends meet, and life in Keddie carried on as usual. But on the night of April 11, 1981, something truly unthinkable happened. By morning, Cabin 28 would become a house of horrors. 3 people were found brutally killed inside. Blood was smeared across the floors and walls. The crime seemed so grotesque and violent that even seasoned investigators were left shaken. To make matters worse, 1 child was missing, vanished without a trace. What happened in Cabin 28 was more than just a crime. It was an act of pure savagery, a night of unimaginable terror that still haunts this small town to this day. In 1979, Glenna Sue Sharp packed up what little she had and set out for a new life. With 5 children in tow, she left Connecticut behind, determined to escape a troubled marriage that had drained her for years. Her husband, James Sharp, was a military man, strict, sometimes controlling, and increasingly volatile. Their marriage had been marked by tension, and Sue had finally had enough. She wanted something better for her children, even if that meant starting from scratch with barely any financial support. Her journey led her across the country, eventually settling in Keddie, California, a tiny secluded town nestled in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Keddie had once been a thriving railroad resort, but by 1981, it had become a modest, quiet community, offering affordable housing for struggling families. To Sue, it seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. She moved her children into Cabin 28, a small, unassuming wooden structure with peeling paint and creaky floors. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Sue did her best to create a warm home despite the hardships. She was a devoted mother, strong, resourceful, and fiercely protective. Raising 5 children alone wasn't easy, but she managed. She stretched every dollar, took odd jobs, and received assistance from the government when necessary. Her children, John 15, Sheila 14, Tina 12, Rick 10, and Greg 5 were adjusting to life in Keddie. John Sharp, the eldest son, was a typical teenager, sometimes rebellious, but deeply caring toward his siblings. He looked out for his younger brothers, often stepping in as a father figure. Sheila, the oldest daughter, was responsible and mature beyond her years, helping her mother with household chores and watching over her siblings. Tina, at 12, was quiet and shy, but had a creative side. Rick and Greg, the youngest, were still too young to fully grasp the struggles their mother faced, but they loved their new home and the adventures that came with living in the woods. Despite their financial struggles, the Sharps were a tight-knit family, doing their best to build a life in Keddie. The kids made friends in the neighborhood, and Sue had even grown close to some of the other local parents. But beneath the surface, there were warning signs, small unsettling moments that hinted at something dark approaching. Sue had been receiving unwanted attention from certain men in town, particularly from Martin Smart, a local man with a violent past. He made her uncomfortable, but she brushed it off. After all, she had dealt with worse before. She wasn't the type to let fear control her. But the walls of Cabin 28 would soon witness something far worse than financial hardship or unwanted advances. On the night of April 11, 1981, the Sharps went about their evening, as usual, completely unaware that their home was about to become the scene of one of the most brutal and perplexing crimes in American history. At 7:45 a.m., Sheila Sharp, the eldest daughter, returned home after spending the night at a friend's house. She had no reason to expect anything unusual. In fact, she had been looking forward to a quiet morning, maybe even sneaking in a little extra sleep. But as she pushed open the front door, her world came to a screeching halt. The scene before her was something ripped straight from a nightmare. Her mother, Sue Sharp, lay sprawled on the floor of the small living room, her lifeless body covered in blood. Nearby, her brother, John Sharp, just 15 years old, had been killed in a similarly brutal fashion. His best friend, Dana Wingate, 17, lay next to him, equally unrecognizable from the sheer savagery of the attack, and began putting together the details of a grisly crime. Murdered in this cabin were a young mother, Glenda Sue Sharp, her 15-year-old son John, and a neighbor, 17-year-old Dana Wingate. The living room, once filled with warmth and laughter, was now a grisly crime scene. Blood splattered the walls and pooled on the floor. The furniture had been knocked over in what must have been a violent struggle. The air was thick with the metallic scent of blood, and the silence that hung over the cabin was suffocating. Sheila's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, but the shock had taken hold of her body, rendering her frozen. Her eyes darted across the room, scanning the horror before her, trying to make sense of it. Sue Sharp's body was found near the couch, bound with electrical tape and medical tape. She had been gagged with a blue bandana and her own underwear secured tightly with tape. Her throat had been slashed nearly to the point of decapitation. Deep stab wounds covered her chest and body. A claw hammer had been used to bludgeon her face beyond recognition. John had suffered a similar fate. Stab wounds, blunt force trauma. His body showed signs of a struggle, evidence that he had fought back. But against what? Against who? Dana Wingate, the outsider among them, had also been bound and beaten. His injuries were severe. He had been strangled, possibly with a cord, and his head had been bashed in with such force that it left behind gruesome imprints of the crime weapon. It was then that Sheila noticed something equally disturbing. The back bedroom door creaked open. Inside, her younger brothers Rick 10 and Greg 5, along with their friend Justin Smart 12, were alive, completely unharmed. The boys had slept through the entire ordeal, unaware that just feet away their mother and older brother had been brutally slaughtered. But there was one person missing: Tina Sharp, who was just 12 years old. She wasn't among the bodies in the living room, nor was she in the bedroom with the younger boys. The only sign of her was an odd, empty space in the cabin, as if something or someone had been taken. Panic set in. Sheila turned and ran sprinting to the neighbor's cabin for help. What followed was a small-town tragedy unfolding in real time. The sheriff's department was called. Neighbors began gathering outside, and within minutes, the quiet town of Keddie was plunged into chaos. The moment deputies from the Plumas County Sheriff's Office stepped inside cabin 28, they were struck by the overpowering stench of blood. The small, dimly lit living room had been transformed into a grotesque slaughterhouse. The bodies of Sue Sharp, John Sharp, and Dana Wingate lay lifeless, bound with medical tape and electrical cords. The brutality was beyond comprehension. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a statement. Investigators noted blood spatter on the walls, the floor, and even the ceiling. The sheer amount of force used suggested a sustained attack, one that lasted minutes, if not longer. One of the knives was bent at a disturbing 90-degree angle, a clear sign that whoever wielded it had stabbed with such force that the blade gave out before they did. Sue's lifeless body was positioned on her side, her hands bound tightly with medical tape. Blood had soaked through her clothing, forming a dark, ominous pool beneath her. But there was something even more unsettling. She had been partially undressed, suggesting the possibility of a sexual component to the crime. Despite this, there was no definitive evidence of sexual assault. John and Dana, meanwhile, lay side by side, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. Dana's head was caved in, likely from repeated blows with the claw hammer. John's throat had been slashed so deeply that it nearly severed his windpipe. And yet, through all this horror, the most haunting mystery remained. Why had Tina Sharp vanished? Detectives quickly realized that the scene inside cabin 28 defied logic. The level of violence, precision, and sadistic overkill was unlike anything they had encountered before. But then a chilling detail emerged. The bindings on the victims suggested multiple attackers. The knots were inconsistent, some neatly tied, others sloppy and rushed. It was as if different people had restrained them at different times, each with varying levels of skill. Forensics painted a grisly picture of what may have happened that night. Blood spatter analysis indicated that John and Dana had been killed near the front door, their bodies later dragged to where they were found. Sue, however, appeared to have been the primary target, suffering the most extreme violence. And then there was the tape recording. Investigators discovered that someone had attempted to muffle the sounds of the attack. A section of the cabin's walls had been stripped down to expose the insulation, possibly to absorb sound. But most chilling of all, a small piece of medical tape, similar to the one used to bind Sue, was found with bloodied fibers stuck to it as if a gag had been ripped from someone's mouth mid-screen. Whoever committed these heinous acts had not acted in a blind rage. This was controlled, methodical, and disturbingly ritualistic. In the chaos of the crime scene, one detail stood out above all the horror. Tina Sharp was missing. Her small bed in the back room was undisturbed, her belongings untouched. Unlike her brothers who had been left alive in the house, Tina had been taken. But why? The timeline of events became even more twisted when neighbors reported hearing muffled screams around 1:30 a.m., yet no one called the police. Was it fear, apathy, or had the insured? No one would intervene. In the days that followed, search efforts focused on finding Tina. Helicopters scoured the forests. Volunteers combed the nearby roads, creeks, and abandoned train cars. Police even considered the possibility of a ransom demand, but none came. Tina had disappeared without a trace. Forensic evidence hinted that she had been alive when she left for how long, and what had her abductors intended for her. The weeks turned to months, then years, until finally, in 1984, investigators received the call that shattered any lingering hope. A skull fragment along with a decayed blouse had been found 100 miles away in the Feather Falls area. Dental records confirmed what investigators had feared. It was Tina. Her remains had been left exposed to the elements, her body dumped like an afterthought. But there was one final terrifying clue. Not far from where Tina's bones were found, a tiny strip of medical tape lay buried in the dirt, the same kind used to bind Sue Sharp. Tina had been kept alive for an unknown amount of time after the murders, then disposed of when she was no longer needed. But needed for what? Despite the brutality of the crime, no one in Keddie seemed willing to talk. Witness statements were inconsistent. Leads vanished and possible suspects either evaded questioning or provided alibis that felt too convenient. Rumors swirled about the involvement of locals, people who had lived in Keddie before and after the killings, blending seamlessly into the small-town fabric. The two primary suspects were Martin Smart, Justin's stepfather, and his friend Bo Boobed, both of whom had been at the local bar the night of the murders. Martin had a history of domestic violence, and just days after the crime, his wife filed for divorce, citing fear for her life. Even more chilling, he had allegedly told his therapist he had killed Sue Sharp, yet no arrest was ever made. Then there was the mysterious call. In 1984, when Tina's remains were discovered, an anonymous caller contacted the police and gave them the location before the news had been made public. How had they known? More importantly, why did no one follow up on the call? The case lingered in limbo, an open wound in the town of Keddie. Evidence was misplaced. Records were lost, and key witnesses faded into obscurity. For decades, it seemed like the truth of what happened inside Cabin 28 would die with time. Among the gruesome details of the Keddie murders, two objects stood out as silent witnesses to the crime: a claw hammer and a steak knife, bent at an almost 90-degree angle. These weren't just crime weapons. They were symbols of the sheer brutality inflicted on victims. But even more chilling, one of them disappeared for decades. When investigators first processed the crime scene, they noted that a claw hammer had been used to bludgeon the victims. However, one hammer that should have been there, a distinctive blue-handled hammer known to belong to Marty Smart, was missing. Marty himself even made an odd statement to police, claiming that his hammer had been stolen before the killings. This strange detail would only gain significance years later. A break tonight in a 35-year-old murder mystery. Investigators believe that they have found one of the weapons used in the so-called Keddy Cabin murders. CBS 13's Tony Lopez has the dramatic developments in this decades-old case. In 2016, more than 3 decades after the crime, a man scavenging in a dried-up pond just a few miles from Cabin 28 stumbled upon a rusted hammer. It was the same make and model as the one missing from the crime scene. Investigators immediately suspected that it had been deliberately thrown into the water to hide evidence. But with so much time passed, any forensic traces of blood or DNA were long gone. Another eerie detail was the steak knife found at the scene. It had been used with such force that it was bent nearly 90 degrees. This suggested one of two things. The killer was stabbing with uncontrollable rage, exerting more force than necessary. The victim fought back fiercely, causing the knife to bend in the struggle. Either way, this was not the work of someone who simply wanted to kill and escape. This was personal, sadistic, and prolonged. Adding to the mystery, another knife, potentially an even deadlier blade, was never found. Some investigators believe it was taken from the scene by the killer as a trophy or to further cover up evidence. As investigators pieced together the gruesome crime scene at Cabin 28, one question loomed over everything. Who could have committed such an unspeakable act? There were no signs of forced entry, and nothing valuable had been taken, which meant this was not a random break-in or robbery gone wrong. The sheer brutality and overkill suggested deep personal rage, and whoever carried out the act of killing wanted the victims to suffer. But why? And why was Tina Sharp missing? In the weeks that followed, investigators interviewed locals, neighbors, and family members in search of anyone with a motive. Very quickly, they honed in on 2 men, Martin Smart and John Boba Bade. The men suspected in the murders, Boba Bade, who together with the other prime suspect, Marty Smart, are now deceased. Marty Smart lived just a few cabins away from the Sharps and was known for his violent temper. He had a reputation for abusing his wife Marilyn and often clashed with Sue Sharp. Sue had reportedly been counseling Marilyn, urging her to leave Marty, which could have made him resentful. Marilyn later revealed that Marty despised Sue, calling her a bitch and blaming her for interfering in his marriage. On the night of the murders, Marty and his friend Boba Bade had been at the local bar. Marty's wife later stated that he came home that night with strange behavior, burning a pair of blood-stained shoes in their fireplace. Even more suspicious was a later confession Marty allegedly made to his therapist, where he admitted to killing Sue Sharp, but claimed he had nothing to do with the children. However, despite this chilling statement, law enforcement took no immediate action. John Bobade was a former Chicago mobster with a shady past. He had arrived in Keddy shortly before the crime was committed and was living with Marty Smart. The two had an odd friendship with Bobe, frequently egging Marty on when he was angry. Bo had no known connection to the Sharp family, which made his involvement less obvious, but his criminal background and close relationship with Marty made him a strong suspect. However, no solid evidence ever linked Bo to the crime, and he later left town without a trace. Despite these strong leads, the investigation quickly fell apart. Key pieces of evidence mysteriously vanished. The tape recordings of Marty's confession? Gone. Crime scene photos disappeared from police records. No fingerprints, no DNA analysis, nothing that could definitely tie a suspect to the crime. Many locals believed there was a cover-up. It was rumored that Marty Smart had connections to law enforcement, which might explain why he was never charged even after his confession. Years later, new investigators reviewed the case and found that crucial witness statements had been ignored. There were rumors that Tina Sharp had been taken as a living target, possibly for human trafficking or ritualistic purposes, but nothing was proven. No one was ever convicted for the Keddy murders. Marty Smart died in 2006, taking whatever secrets he had to the grave. Bo Booby died in 1988 without ever facing trial. The case remains officially unsolved, though new evidence continues to emerge. In 2016, investigators found a hammer in a dried-up pond that matched the murder weapon missing from the crime scene. Many believe that law enforcement corruption and incompetence allowed the killers to walk free. Even today, the Keddy murders remain one of America's most haunting unsolved crimes. Story 4. They say time heals all wounds, but some crimes only grow darker with time. And for Setsuko Miyazawa, this couldn't be more true. On the morning of December 31st, she stepped into her son's home, expecting a normal visit, only to stumble upon a nightmare that would ignite one of Japan's largest investigations. A brutal crime, an entire family wiped out, and a literal mountain of evidence that should have led to an easy arrest. Yet more than 2 decades later, the case remains a mystery. But what makes this case truly chilling is that, unlike most killers who vanish without a trace, this one didn't. He stayed, ate at least 4 ice creams from their freezer, and even used their toilet without flushing. So the big question is, why hasn't justice been served? The answer to that lies at the end of this video. So, let's dive in. The family at the center of this chilling case is known as the Miyazawa family, a household of 4. Father Mikio Miyazawa, 44, mother Yasuko, 41, daughter Nina, 8, and son Rei, 6. They once lived in a lively Tokyo neighborhood filled with families. But as the city expanded and life became busier, many of their neighbors sold their homes and moved away, seeking quieter places to live. By the end of the year 2000, only 4 houses remained in the area, one of them belonging to the Miyazawas. At first glance, their home looked like a single large house, but in reality, it was 2 attached residences. One side was occupied by the Miyazawa family, while the other housed Yasuko's relatives, mainly her mother, with occasional visits from her sister and brother-in-law. The family had already decided to relocate, as their land had been sold to the city for the planned expansion of Sashogaya Park. However, Yasuko postponed the move, worried about how the transition would affect her children, especially Rei, who had a developmental disorder. As a dedicated tutor, Yasuko understood the importance of stability and education, and she even ran a cram school from their home, helping other children succeed. By all accounts, the Miyazawas were a close-knit, hard-working family, respected by those who knew them. But on the night of December 30, 2000, everything changed. The morning of that day began like any other, with the Miyazawa family preparing for the upcoming New Year celebrations. Like many families in Tokyo, they spent part of their day shopping near Chitose Karasuyama Station, picking up festive supplies before returning home for a quiet evening together. They ate dinner, watched television, and eventually settled in for the night, unaware that their final hours were already counting down. What happened next remains one of Japan's most baffling mysteries, still debated and speculated upon decades later. But here's what we do know. Sometime after 11 o'clock that night, an unknown man made his way toward the Miyazawa home, the nearby Sashogaya Park. Using a fence in the backyard, he climbed up to the second-floor bathroom window. Some reports suggest he may have also used a tree, as broken branches were later found nearby. Once he reached the open window, he removed the screen and silently slipped inside. From there, the intruder moved through the house first, entering the nearest bedroom, 6-year-old Ray's room. The little boy was sleeping peacefully, completely unaware of the danger looming over him. Unlike the rest of his family, Ray was not stabbed. Instead, the killer strangled him to death, leaving his small body lifeless in bed before moving on to the rest of the house. Keep in mind that there are some inconsistencies in what exactly happened after this. However, some reports suggest that Mikio Miyazawa, upon hearing a commotion upstairs, rushed to check on his family, only to come face to face with the intruder. In an instant, the killer pulled out a sashimi knife, a long razor-sharp blade used for slicing seafood, and launched a brutal attack. Mikio fought back, trying to resist, but the killer struck repeatedly. Some sources claim that during the struggle, Mikio stumbled and fell down the stairs, where he eventually bled to death from multiple stab wounds. Others say the killer initially attacked Mikio downstairs, and as he tried to escape, he collapsed near the staircase, unable to reach safety. However, one thing is certain. Mikio's body was found at the base of the stairs, with a fragment of the murder weapon still embedded in his skull. With Mikio dead, the intruder turned his attention to the last two remaining family members, 41-year-old Yasuko and their 8-year-old daughter Nina. Both were asleep in the attic, unaware of the horror unfolding below them. Unlike the previous attacks, the details of their murders remain shrouded in uncertainty, but forensic evidence suggests that the killer crept into the attic and struck while they were still asleep. Bloodstains on the futon hint at a sudden, merciless attack. At some point, either before or during the assault, the killer discarded the broken sashimi knife and grabbed another weapon, a Western-style kitchen knife from the Miyazawa family's own kitchen. This new blade would be used to finish what he had started. In a desperate bid to escape, Yasuko and Nina tried to flee down the foldable attic ladder that connected the upper level to the rest of the house, but the intruder was faster. Their bodies were later discovered at the top of the second-floor staircase, huddled close together. It was clear that they had fought for their lives. Nina, in particular, suffered a fate even more horrific than the others. She had not only been stabbed repeatedly, but had also been beaten so brutally that several of her teeth had been knocked out. Forensic analysis later revealed the most chilling detail of all. Nina was the last to die. Out of the thousands of cases we've examined, this one stands out as one of the most bizarre and unsettling. A cold-blooded massacre of a family of 4, 2 parents and 2 young children, should have been where the horror ended, but it wasn't. What happened next defied all logic, earning this crime the chilling nickname, the Goldilocks murder. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Unlike most killers who flee the scene as quickly as possible, this one didn't. Evidence suggests he remained inside the Miyazawa home for at least 2 hours after committing the murders, moving about as if he had every right to be there. The exact sequence of events remains unclear, but forensic analysis paints a disturbing picture of what unfolded. After slaughtering the family, the killer strolled past their lifeless bodies, casually making his way to the kitchen. There he raided the fridge, pulling out several tubs of ice cream. a bottle of barley tea, and according to some sources, even a slice of melon. Then, without so much as a second thought, he started eating near minutes after the brutal attack. But what makes this act even stranger is how he ate the ice cream. Instead of using a spoon, he squeezed the tubs until the contents pushed up to the top, then bit directly into them, leaving saliva and fingerprints behind. It was as if he didn't care about being caught, or worse, as if he wanted to leave a trace. As he feasted, he realized he had injured himself during the attack, likely from the sashimi knife breaking as he stabbed Mikio. Instead of panicking, he simply grabbed the family's first aid kit, patched up his hand, and left the blood-soaked bandages in plain sight. This careless act would later provide investigators with a valuable blood sample, but he didn't stop there. He then made his way to the storage room on the first floor and started rifling through the Miyazawa's personal documents. Strangely, instead of taking anything of real value, he removed an entire drawer's worth of papers, carried them upstairs, and dumped them into the bathtub in the second-floor bathroom. The meaning behind this act remains unknown. And then, in what is perhaps the most unsettling detail of all, he used the bathroom to defecate. He left the waste unflushed, further contaminating the scene with DNA evidence. Afterward, he wiped his hands on a bathroom towel, smearing his own blood onto the fabric before walking out. Some reports suggest he then took a nap on the family's sofa, but this remains a point of debate. What is confirmed, however, is that at some point he removed several pieces of clothing, his jacket, hat, shirt, and scarf, and left them behind. Alongside these items, investigators found 2 handkerchiefs, a fanny pack, and a pair of black gloves. Even more shocking, both murder weapons, the sashimi knife he had brought with him and the kitchen knife he had taken from the Miyazawa's home, were abandoned at the scene. Although the exact sequence of events remains debated, one thing is certain. At approximately 1:18 in the morning, the Miyazawa family's computer was turned on. According to system logs, the killer not only powered up Mikio's computer, but also created a new folder. Some sources even claim that he used the internet to visit the website of a local theater company, though this has never been fully confirmed. The sheer audacity of this act, calmly using the family's computer, while their bodies lay just feet away, only adds to the eerie nature of the case. Later investigators discovered another log showing that the computer had been activated again at 10 o'clock in the morning. Initially, police believed this meant the killer had stayed inside the house for nearly 10 hours after the murders. The idea that he had spent an entire night inside moving around the blood-stained home without a care was chilling. However, further analysis revealed that the second activation was likely unintentional. When Yasuko's mother, Haruko, entered the house that morning and discovered the crime scene, she may have accidentally bumped the mouse, waking the computer from sleep mode. If that was the case, the killer most likely left the house between 1:18 in the morning and dawn, reducing the estimated time he spent inside to at least 2 hours. But those 2 hours were enough for the case to become one of the most baffling and chilling cases in Japan's history. The horror was discovered later that morning, at around 10:30, when Haruko, worried that Yasuko hadn't answered her calls, decided to check on the family. As she stepped inside, she was met with a nightmare: her son-in-law, Mikio, lying at the base of the stairs, lifeless. Overwhelmed with shock, she immediately called the police. When authorities arrived, they found not only 4 brutally murdered victims, but also a staggering amount of physical evidence left behind. There were fingerprints and shoe prints scattered throughout the house, DNA samples from the killer's blood, likely from the wound he sustained, and discarded clothing, including his own hat, shirt, scarf, and gloves. Both murder weapons were left carelessly at the scene, and in perhaps the most disturbing detail, unflushed feces in the toilet contained even more DNA. With such an overwhelming amount of forensic evidence, investigators were confident this would be an open and shut case. One former senior police official even remarked that the crime scene was a mountain of treasure and that everyone thought an arrest was just around the corner. But in the years that followed, this assumption could not have been further from the truth. The clothing left behind provided a remarkably clear picture of what the killer was wearing that night, even down to where he had likely purchased his clothes and what cologne he had on. Police determined that the suspect had been wearing a gray Crusher bucket hat, a white baseball shirt with purple sleeves, a cheap plaid scarf with no tags, a Uniqlo AirTech jacket, black gloves, and a gray and black fanny pack. The various footprints left at the scene also revealed that he had been wearing Schlesinger sneakers approximately 27.5 centimeters in size. With all this information, authorities created a composite image of the killer's attire to distribute to potential witnesses in the area. Once they had a solid visual of what the perpetrator looked like, investigators shifted their focus to the murder weapon and DNA evidence. In most murder cases, DNA is one of the most critical pieces of evidence, and the Miyazawa family's killer left it all over the house. From saliva to hair blood, and even feces, his genetic makeup was scattered throughout the crime scene. While this should have been a breakthrough for the case, Japan's strict personal information laws complicated matters. Despite these restrictions, leaked reports suggested that the killer was likely between 15 and 35 years old, as he needed to be athletic enough to climb to the second-floor window. He was estimated to be between 5'6" and 5'7" tall, with a slender build, as indicated by the 32-inch waist belt on his hip bag. DNA analysis confirmed that he was male, with type A blood, and the contents of his stomach, as revealed by his feces, suggested that his last meal consisted of string beans and sesame seeds. However, when police ran his fingerprints through their database, they found no matches indicating that he had no prior criminal record. Now armed with extensive details about the suspect's clothing, physical traits, and DNA, the police circulated the information to the public in hopes of identifying him. Yet, as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, no one came forward with a name. One of the biggest challenges in the case was that despite the abundance of physical evidence left behind, most of it was unremarkable. The clothing consisted of mass-produced items sold in the hundreds and available almost anywhere. The fingerprint evidence yielded no matches within Japan's database, leaving investigators with little insight into the perpetrator's movements or origins. However, two particular items, the suspect's shoes and hip bag, provided much-needed clues that narrowed the scope of the search. The first breakthrough came from the perpetrator's shoes. Investigators discovered that the 27.5 centimeter sized Schlesinger sneakers he wore were never sold in Japan. Instead, they were exclusively available in South Korea. This revelation suggested that the suspect had either lived in or visited Korea at some point. Given that Korean law requires all citizens over the age of 17, as well as all visitors, to provide fingerprints upon arrival, the Japanese police collaborated with the Korean government to compare the crime scene fingerprints against their national database. Unfortunately, this search yielded no matches once again, leaving investigators at a dead end. The second clue came from the suspect's hip bag, which significantly expanded the scope of the investigation beyond Japan, leading all the way to the United States. Analyzing the bag's contents, police found grip tape used for skateboards, trace amounts of the men's cologne, Dracarenoir, and small particles of sand. Upon further testing, It was revealed that this sand did not originate from Japan, but instead came from Los Angeles, California. This revelation completely upended investigators' initial theories about the perpetrator, forcing them to reconsider the suspect's possible origins and connections. As time passed and tips continued to pour in, new discoveries emerged, each more puzzling than the last. Some findings helped clarify certain aspects of the case, while others only deepened the area on the night of the murder. When interviewed, the driver recalled picking up 3 men near the crime scene. These men matched the general age and build of the suspect, and one of them appeared to be injured, even leaving a blood stain on the taxi seat before exiting the vehicle. This report raised an unsettling question. Could these men have been involved in the murder? However, this conflicted with key evidence from the crime scene, which strongly suggested that only a single perpetrator had been present. Eyewitness reports also provided another strange lead in the case. The day after the murder, staff at a medical center near Tabonico Station, several hours north of Setagaya, reported treating a man in his mid-30s who had arrived with a severe hand injury. The wound was so deep that nurses could see bone. However, despite their repeated questions about how he sustained it, the man refused to give any explanation. His reluctance to speak made the encounter suspicious enough for the staff to alert the police. Adding to the mystery were 2 handkerchiefs found at the crime scene, one intact, and the other with a hole cut in. The initially puzzled police turned to the public for insights. Responses suggested that the handkerchief with a hole may have been used to secure a knife handle, a common practice among fishermen handling large fish like tuna, as it improves grip. Others speculated that one handkerchief might have been used to hold the weapon without leaving fingerprints, while the other was worn as a makeshift mask. However, this theory raised a contradiction. Why would the killer bother avoiding fingerprints on the knife when he left them all over the house? These inconsistencies plagued investigators for years, stalling progress and reducing the chances of catching the perpetrator. Beyond the overwhelming evidence, a major challenge in the investigation was identifying a motive. The Miyazawa family was well liked, had no known enemies, and no apparent conflicts that would warrant such a brutal crime. With no clear suspect, police were forced to examine every possible lead, starting with the most common theories. In most cases like this, the first assumption is a burglary gone wrong. However, multiple factors contradicted this idea. Typically, burglars strike when a house is likely to be empty, yet the attack on the Miyazawas happened in the evening when all family members were home. More disturbingly, the killer's first act upon entering the house was to strangle 6-year-old Ray, who was asleep and posed no threat. If robbery was the goal, the perpetrator would have prioritized searching for valuables, not immediately committing murder. In fact, the killer only made a weak attempt to retrieve valuables after slaughtering the entire family. Yet even then, he left most of the items behind or discarded them in the bathtub. Some sources suggest that the killer left the crime scene with around 15,000 yen, roughly $1,500. However, what truly baffled investigators was that nearly $2,000 in cash was left behind. This led police to believe that theft was not his primary motive. If he had come just to steal, why would he ignore so much money? Given the sheer brutality of the murders and the killer's complete disregard for evidence, many believe he was either a serial killer or someone with extreme psychological issues and violent tendencies. The strongest argument for this theory lies in the killer's behavior after the crime. Rather than fleeing, he made himself at home, eating their food, using their toilet, and even taking a nap in their living room while the victims' bodies lay nearby. This lack of remorse was chilling. Another unsettling detail was the level of violence directed at the women in the family. Yasuko, the mother, fought desperately against her attacker and suffered severe injuries as a result. Her wounds indicated that she struggled until the very end. Mina, the youngest daughter, was the last to die, and her body showed signs of horrific overkill. Even after she had passed, the killer continued to stab and beat her, breaking her teeth and causing massive internal bleeding. This excessive violence led some to theorize that the killer harbored deep hatred toward women, possibly suggesting a personal vendetta or misogynistic rage, with burglary and serial murder considered the only remaining motive was revenge. However, this theory had a major flaw. The Miyazawa family was well liked with no known enemies. Friends and colleagues described Mikio, the father, as a friendly and easygoing man who never stirred conflict. The only incident that stood out was a minor dispute days before the murder. Mikio had complained about a group of skaters making too much noise at the skate park behind their house. One of the earliest theories was that these skaters, angered by his complaint, decided to retaliate in the most extreme way possible by slaughtering his entire family. While this theory seemed outlandish, it did align with an early eyewitness account. A taxi driver reported picking up 3 men shortly after the murder, one of whom had a fresh hand injury. Investigators speculated that one of them could have been the killer, while the other 2 acted as lookouts. This theory gained further traction when police examined the evidence left behind. The clothes abandoned at the scene matched the style commonly worn by skaters at the time, and the killer's hip bag contained pieces of skater's tape. However, when police interviewed local skaters from Sashogaya Park, they found no suspicious individuals or connections to the Miyazawa family. The idea that a noise complaint escalated into a quadruple homicide was hard for both police and the public to believe. It seemed too extreme a reaction for such a minor grievance. Strangely enough, the most intriguing clue came from an unexpected source: grains of sand found inside the killer's hit bag. When analyzed, the sand was traced back to California, specifically to an area just north of Los Angeles. This bizarre detail raised a haunting question. How did sand from California end up in the bag of a murderer in Setagaya, Japan? The answer, some believe, lies in a controversial but crucial piece of evidence. The killer's DNA, blood samples left at the crime scene, allowed police to analyze his genetic profile, revealing something unexpected. The DNA suggested that the killer had mixed ancestry. His mother likely had roots in Southern Europe, while his father had East Asian heritage. This revelation only deepened the mystery. Who was he? What was he doing in Japan? And why did he target the Miyazawa family? One of the most widely discussed theories suggests that the killer was likely military. Now, how do we know this? The answer lies in the sand. As previously mentioned, forensic analysis determined that the sand found at the crime scene originated from an area near the Mojave Desert in California, specifically around Edwards Air Base. Theorists believe that the killer may have been stationed at this air base while serving in the United States military, which is where he picked up the sand found in his hip bag. Later, he was transferred to Japan, most likely to Yokote Air Base, which happens to be located just about an hour away from the Miyazawa family's home. For this theory to hold up, the killer, now presumed to be a U.S. military member, needed to understand Japanese. Evidence suggests he could read Japanese documents, allowing him to decide which papers to throw into the bathtub and which to leave behind. Of course, it's also possible that he randomly discarded documents, but this is where his mixed heritage comes into play. Some believe the killer was the child of a soldier who married a foreigner while stationed overseas. This could mean that although he may not have grown up in Japan, he learned the language from a parent and possibly visited the country during his childhood, making him familiar with the area and local customs. This theory connects multiple pieces of evidence. First, the idea that the killer was military makes sense when considering the physical strength required to carry out such a brutal attack. Investigators initially estimated the killer was young because of the level of athleticism needed not only to scale the back wall of the house and enter through the second-floor bathroom window, but also to commit such a violent act. Second, the possibility that he was part foreigner would explain why there were no official Japanese records of him. However, his partial Japanese heritage would mean he was fluent in the language and possibly familiar enough with the city's transit system to confidently stay in the house for hours after the crime, knowing exactly how to leave undetected. Since this theory ties together several pieces of evidence, it has become one of the most popular explanations among both the media and online forums. However, it is not the only theory that has gained traction. Years later, journalist Fumio Ichihashi proposed a different theory in his book about the case, arguing that the killer was actually a former member of the South Korean military turned hitman. According to Ichihashi, the company developing the Miyazawa family's neighborhood may have hired this hitman to speed up the redevelopment process. Ichihashi pointed to DNA evidence that strongly suggests the killer was South Korean, as the markers found were significantly more common in Korean individuals than in Japanese individuals. If the killer had served in the South Korean military, he would have possessed the necessary strength and combat skills to carry out the attack. Additionally, this theory provides something most others lack: a motive. While the Miyazawa family had already sold their land, they repeatedly delayed their move due to concerns about their children adjusting to a new environment. Eventually, they became one of the last families remaining in the neighborhood. Ichihashi believes this may have frustrated developers, prompting them to take drastic measures by hiring a hitman. This theory supports several key details. The military background would explain the sand found in the hit bag, while the DNA evidence aligns with the possibility of a South Korean suspect. It also accounts for the Schlesinger sneakers worn by the killer, as the specific size found at the crime scene was only ever sold in South Korea. However, this theory leaves several critical questions unanswered. Why would a hitman linger at the crime scene for hours after completing his task? Why would he leave behind so much DNA evidence? Additionally, the sheer brutality of the murders, especially the fact that the victims were beaten and stabbed even after death, suggests a personal motive rather than a professional assassination. Another major issue is that the killer's fingerprints were cross-checked with South Korea's fingerprint database, and no matches were found. This means the killer was neither born in South Korea, nor had he visited the country, unless he had somehow managed to evade legal biometric records for years. One of the most far-fetched theories was discussed by investigative journalist Nicholas Obregon on his podcast Faceless. According to this theory, the killer may have been a child or teenager. While this might sound unbelievable, some pieces of evidence lend it credibility. A particularly suspicious post on the anonymous Japanese forum 2chan, later renamed 5chan, adds to the intrigue. In a discussion thread where users shared experiences with animal cruelty, a self-proclaimed 13-year-old boy using the alias Mr. Korematsu posted something chilling. Now when I see the happy family next door, I want to do something like that Oita family murder case. The closing date is December 31st at 11:59 p.m. I'm thinking about killing it off before the 21st century arrives. The Oita family murder case he referenced bore disturbing similarities to the Miyazawa family's case. In the Oita case, a family was attacked in their home at night, leaving 3 people dead and 3 others in critical condition. The perpetrator turned out to be a 15-year-old boy. The fact that the Setagaya family murder occurred just 2 days after Mr. Korematsu's post has led some to wonder if it was more than just a coincidence. Because the original poster was never identified, there is no way to confirm whether he was referring to the Miyazawa family or whether he was even being truthful. However, the theory raises some intriguing points. If the killer was a minor, his fingerprints wouldn't be in any criminal database, making him much harder to trace. Some also point out that the last meal the killer ate, string beans and sesame seeds, is commonly prepared as a home-cooked meal by children, possibly suggesting that he still lived at home. That said, this theory contradicts several crucial pieces of evidence. It does not explain why sand from Edwards Air Base was found in the suspect's bag, nor how a 13-year-old boy could possess the physical strength to scale a back wall and carry out such a violent massacre. Because of these inconsistencies, most people familiar with the case dismiss this theory outright. Despite the flaws in each theory, investigators have had no choice but to explore every possibility. With no suspects and no leads, authorities have had to grasp at any shred of information. In a desperate attempt to solve the case, police even offered a reward of 20 million yen, nearly $19,000, for any information leading to an arrest. This is the largest reward ever offered by Japanese law enforcement, fueling an extensive investigation that has continued for decades. With over 24,000 detectives and more than 12,000 pieces of evidence, this case isn't just big, it's one of the biggest in Japanese history. And yet, after all these years, not a single step closer to justice. Every lead, a dead end, every clue, a frustrating puzzle with no solution. But that hasn't stopped detectives from trying, even if progress has been painfully slow. For 2 decades, Setsuko Miyazawa has refused to let her family's story be forgotten. Rain or shine, she's out there at Chito-esque Karasuyama Station, handing out flyers, hoping that someone somewhere knows something. Story 5. This chaos, unfolding before you, is not caused by a street criminal, a drug mafia gang, or a wanted criminal. In front of this barrel was a respected judge, a former lawmaker, and a man who once held the power to decide the fate of others. But behind the polished image was a darkness no one saw coming, until it was far too late. What unfolded next would leave an entire community shaken and a family broken forever. Holy fuck. As the police tried to catch him, Lance ran through the back door of his sister's house. Who is Lance Mason? And what on earth did he do to have a full task force arriving for his arrest? Lance Timothy Mason was not just another public servant. He was an epitome of authority, a man who had worn every badge of trust a city could offer, from walking the marble halls of the Ohio State House to commanding silence in the courtroom. As a common pleas judge, his presence demanded respect, and his voice carried weight. He'd once shaped laws and passed judgments, upheld justice with a steady hand, and stood beside those shaping national policy. In every room he entered, eyes turned. In every position he held, power followed. His resume painted a portrait of excellence, polished and precise. State representative, senator, judge, city official. Mason didn't just play the game, he seemed to master it. And yet, as he climbed, something else rose with him. Something that stayed hidden behind the speeches and handshakes. Something that no title could erase. But just when he thought he was untouchable, police were searching his sanctuary, looking for him like a wanted criminal. Watch it. They've got the dog up there. They're upstairs. I don't know what's going on. Get down. Watch it. Get down now. I got contact. Put your hands behind your back. Do it now. Do it now. Watch, watch. Is anyone else in the house? My daughter's in my house. In the quiet corners of his world, behind closed doors. And far from the flash of cameras, a tension was building. Those who paid close enough attention might have felt it. The way his polished smile sometimes didn't reach his eyes, the flicker of control beneath the calm. No one asked, and he never said. But the air around him began to shift slowly, at first like the hush before a storm. Then one day that storm came. November 17, 2018. The day was supposed to be like any other, but for Aisha Fraser, it would be the last day she saw her children, the last day she could breathe freely. The two were supposed to meet at a decided place. It was the house owned by Lance Mason's sister, a house that would become the scene of unimaginable horror. Lance had already decided the fate of Aisha Fraser that day, a knife used as a weapon to stab the mother of his children. Lance Mason didn't just lose control, he planned it. In front of their two children, who could do nothing but watch in paralyzing fear, he attacked her. The sound of the knife cutting through the air was drowned by the agonizing cries of their children. They screamed for their mom, but it was already too late. And then, in a final act of desperation, Mason fled. He didn't stop. He stole Aisha's SUV and sped off, but his attempt to escape wouldn't last long. In his reckless flight, he collided with a police cruiser, slamming into it with brutal force. The officer inside was injured, but Mason's terror was only beginning. He kept running, thinking he could outrun his past, but fate had other plans. It wasn't long before the law caught up to him, and nightmare he'd set in motion would begin to unravel. Inside the house, Lynn Mason, his own sister, was on the phone with 911, her voice shaking with disbelief as she watched her brother destroy everything in his path. He stabbed her, and she is dead, she said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. Meanwhile, in the background, the children sobbed uncontrollably. Their cries were haunting evidence to the horror that had just unfolded. And when it did, it would leave scars so deep that even the highest seat of justice couldn't overlook them. The man who had once delivered verdicts from the bench would soon find himself on the other side of the law, bending his knees on the floor like he never saw what true power looked like. Let's get on your knees, on your knees. Hold on, this all the way up. Oh, you got someone with you. Okay, hang on, you got him. His wrist is squirting out blood. We need him to the ambulance now. He's squirting out blood. Okay, come on. Watch, watch, watch. Where's the ambulance at? But not yet. Not just yet. The story hadn't reached its climax. Not until the mask slipped. Not until the truth clawed its way to the surface. Okay, have a seat, right here. As his hands told the tale of the horrific fate that Aisha Fraser was met with, it was difficult to tell him apart from the charismatic man that he once was. Or was he ever that man? People will be left wondering. But before the horrific scenes of 2018, Lance had already given hints of what monstrosity he was capable of. It was a hot summer day on August 2014, when the image of Lance Mason, the once respected judge and former state senator, was torn apart in a storm of rage and violence that no one saw coming. He wasn't wearing a robe that day. He wasn't behind a bench delivering rulings. He was behind the wheel of a car, his wife beside him, and their children in the back seat. What should have been just another ride turned into a nightmare. Without warning, the calm shattered. Mason began pummeling his wife with his fists, 20 savage blows one after another, as if he had lost all sense of control, all sense of humanity. But he didn't stop there. With their terrified children watching from the back seat, he grabbed her head and slammed it into the car's center console. Not once, Not twice, 5 brutal times. The force was enough to leave her dazed, bloodied, and in sheer panic. She tried to escape, desperate to get out. But even then, outside the car, away from the steering wheel and the false sense of safety he followed, he bit her, he threatened her. His rage didn't cool. It followed her out of the vehicle like a predator, locked on its prey. When the police arrested him later that day, the horror only deepened. Inside Mason's home was not the quiet, book-filled sanctuary one might expect from a judge. It was a war zone. Shotguns, semi-automatic rifles, handguns, smoked grenades, a bulletproof vest, a sword, and more than 2,500 rounds of ammunition. It looked less like the home of a public servant and more like the stockpile of someone preparing for combat. It was chilling. Not just the violence he had committed, but the world he had built behind closed doors. That attack got him 2 years in prison, but he only served 9 months. A slap on the wrist, a second chance he never deserved. You know why it was just a slap on the wrist when Lance Mason first beat his wife? Because powerful people were right there beside him, shielding him, vouching for him, smoothing the way. Back then, he punched her so hard she had to undergo surgery for a broken orbital bone. Their daughters were in the car when it happened. It wasn't just domestic violence. It was terrifying. And yet, when it came time to face consequences, Mason had an army of high-profile supporters ready to downplay the horror. U.S. Representative Marcia Fudge called him a good man who made a very bad mistake. Letters poured in from politicians, attorneys, and judges, all speaking about his character, his decades of service, his reputation. The victim, Aisha Fraser, barely seemed to factor in. That collective influence worked. Mason got just 2 years in prison and was released after serving 9 months. 9 months for disfiguring a woman in front of her children. And then just a few years later, he murdered her, stabbed her to death in front of those same daughters. Suddenly, those glowing endorsements from the political and legal elite became a stain. Marcia Fudge released a statement expressing heartbreak and claiming that the man who committed the murder wasn't the Lance Mason she knew. But that raises an uncomfortable question. If someone beats their partner so viciously they need surgery, how much more evidence do you need to protect the victim? During disciplinary hearings in 2017, other attorneys and judges again came to Mason's defense. They wrote letters expressing disbelief and emphasizing his achievements as a jurist. But the Ohio State Bar Association wasn't convinced. In their statement to the Supreme Court, they called out the letters for failing to explain what led to Mason's violent actions or offer any assurance that it wouldn't happen again. This is more than just a case of poor judgment. It's a case study in how power protects power, even when it comes at the expense of a woman's life. Aisha was failed first by the justice system, then by the people who had the platform to do better. Instead of calling out the violence for what it was, too many were eager to excuse it, to write it off as an aberration from a man they respected. But monsters don't always look like monsters until it's too late. The hypocrisy is hard to stomach. The same people who once praised Mason's uncharacteristic mistake were suddenly offering condolences in shock. But here's the truth. They saw the violence, and they still chose to protect him. Aisha did everything right. She got the protection order. She followed the system. But Lance Mason had already made his choice. And long before the headlines and the whispers before the scandal shattered the calm and sent shockwaves through Ohio's political circles, Lance Timothy Mason was just a boy growing up in Shaker Heights, bright, ambitious, and already dreaming of something bigger. Born on August 26, 1967, He followed a path that seemed carved out for greatness, from the hallways of Shaker Heights High School to the academic rigor of the College of Worcester, and finally to the esteemed University of Michigan Law School, where he earned his Juris Doctor in 1992. Mason's journey looked like the making of a legacy. Every step he took was calculated. Every role he stepped into only added to his growing reputation. Between 2002 and 2008, Mason served in the Ohio General Assembly, first as a representative and then as a senator, moving through the ranks with a confidence that suggested he wasn't just part of the system, he was built for it. His dedication and charm caught the attention of then-Governor Ted Strickland, who appointed him as a judge to the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas in 2008, a position of weight and visibility, a place where power wasn't just practiced, it was absolute. But the climb didn't end there. Nearly a decade later, in 2017, Mason returned to public service, this time as the Minority Business Development Administrator under Cleveland Mayor Frank G. Jackson. To outsiders, it seemed like a full-circle moment, an accomplished man continuing to serve, continuing to lead. His name appeared in political rosters and press releases, his image still polished, and his influence very much intact. This was not a man at the beginning of his fall. This was someone already deep in descent. Mason had married his wife in 2005, but they were preparing for divorce, and by March 2014, they had separated. Still, that separation didn't offer her safety. Not truly. Their divorce would only be finalized over a year later, in November 2015. The courtroom fell silent as Lance Mason, once a powerful figure, draped in robes and respected in legal circles, stepped forward, now wearing a prison jumpsuit, wrists bound in cuffs. This wasn't a man accused of a mistake or a moment of weakness. This was a man now facing the most horrific charge of all, the calculated violent murder of his ex-wife, Aisha Fraser. It was a cold, unforgiving day on Chagrin Boulevard when the horror unfolded behind the closed doors of Fraser's home. There were no warnings, no second chances. According to the grand jury, Mason didn't just kill, he planned it. With purpose and calculation, he carried out an attack so brutal it sent shockwaves through the very community he once served. Aisha Fraser, a beloved mother and school teacher, was stabbed to death. She had trusted the system to protect her. She had a protection order in place, but that paper shield was no match for the man who had already proven what he was capable of. But you understand, sir, that you are charged with one count of aggravated murder, one count of murder, one count of felonious assault, one count of violating the protection order, one count of grand theft, and one count of felonious assault. Do you understand the charges against you? Yes, Your Honor. Do you wish to enter a plea, sir? Not guilty. Court accepts the plea of not guilty. At his arraignment, Mason stood still as the charges were read out one by one. Aggravated murder, felonious assault, twice, violating a protection order, grand theft. Each count painted a clearer picture of a man spiraling deeper into darkness. Each word, a knife to the memory of who he once was. And still, he pleaded not guilty. The judge listened, watched, and responded with a bond that matched the weight of the crime, $5 million. A staggering amount for a staggering fall. But no number could reverse what had happened. No courtroom procedure could bring Aisha Fraser back. But then things changed for him. Whether it was his ego in the way, or hidden love for his children, Lance pleaded guilty of his crimes in his pre-trial hearing. Sitting there in the Cuyahoga County Court of Common Pleas, he looked every bit the man who had shattered so many lives with his actions. With an unsettling calm, He said that he wishes to take responsibility for the crimes he had committed. Those words were heavy, but they didn't feel like remorse. They felt like a man just going through the motions, as if this was some kind of routine procedure, not the acknowledgement of a life-altering, soul-crushing tragedy. But then he dropped a sentence that showed his vulnerability. There was no way I was going to let my daughter testify against me. As those words left his mouth, it became clear. Story 5 continued. This wasn't just a crime of passion or rage. It was calculated, cold. This was a man scared to face his daughter in the court, scared of losing the delusion of being a great father that he thought he was to his children. While I respect your decision to spare them the trauma of a trial, it was too little and way too late. Mason pled guilty to some of the most atrocious charges imaginable: aggravated murder, 2 counts of felonious assault murder, violating a protection order, and grand theft. Every single charge was a grim reminder of the violence he had unleashed that day. As the courtroom absorbed the weight of his admission, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. This wasn't just a man who had gone astray. This was a man who had once held power, who had been trusted with the law, but now was nothing more than a broken figure sitting before a judge to answer for the unspeakable destruction he had caused. Aisha Fraser was more than just a name in the news. She was a devoted mother, a cherished friend, and a beloved school teacher in Shaker Heights, Ohio. To her students, she was a source of light. To her community, she was a role model. But on a quiet November day, her life was stolen in the most horrifying way imaginable by a man who once promised to be her protector. Aisha saw the worst in a man who rose to the highest rank in a system that failed her so many times to a point of losing her life. That's the tragedy that sparked Aisha's Law, a bold piece of legislation introduced by Ohio State Representative Janine Boyd, and now supported by over 32 co-sponsors in the Ohio House. But Aisha's Law isn't just about one woman. It's about every person trapped in a cycle of domestic abuse, and it's about finally changing a system that failed her, one that fails so many. Now, what exactly is Aisha's Law? It is a multi-layered bill designed to intervene before abuse turns deadly. It's based on one simple truth, that domestic violence homicides are predictable. Victims often show signs, abusers escalate, and yet too often the system doesn't catch the red flags until it's too late. This bill aims to change that. It includes mandatory risk assessment training for police. Officers would be trained to identify high-risk abusers, the kind most likely to commit lethal violence. Instead of treating each case as isolated, officers would learn to ask the right questions, recognize patterns, and respond with urgency. This means victims at the highest risk could finally be protected before tragedy strikes. Number 2 is the 24/7 access to protection orders. If someone needs a protection order at 2 a.m. on a Sunday, they shouldn't have to wait until Monday morning. Aisha's Law would require courts to have judges or magistrates available 24/7 to issue emergency protective orders, because violence doesn't wait, and neither should justice. The third key point includes an expanded definition of child endangerment, which means that if a child is present when abuse happens, that's not just a side note, it's another layer of trauma. The bill expands child endangerment to include witnessing domestic violence, holding abusers accountable for the psychological damage inflicted on children, even if they aren't physically harmed. And then lastly, a broader definition of aggravated murder. It expands the definition of aggravated murder to directly reflect the reality of domestic violence cases like Aisha Fraser's. It means that if someone purposely kills a family or household member, and they already have a past conviction for domestic violence or any violent offense that caused serious harm to that same person, it can now be charged as aggravated murder. Let's be clear, this is huge. Why? Because in many past cases, abusers who escalated from beatings to murder weren't charged with the most serious level of homicide, even if their violence was part of a clear pattern. This update closes that gap and says if you've seriously hurt someone before and you come back and kill them, you're facing the highest possible charge under the law. Why does this matter so much? Because Aisha Fraser did everything right. She left. She got help. She followed the legal steps. But the system didn't protect her. Her daughters witnessed the unthinkable, their mother's murder, after watching her suffer for years. This bill doesn't just honor Aisha's memory, it arms communities' law enforcement and the justice system with the tools they need to prevent similar tragedies. And the stats are chilling. Nearly 112 Ohioans died from domestic violence in a single year. The stats also show that nearly half of domestic violence victims in Cleveland are at high risk of being killed. And shockingly, in Cuyahoga County, only 1 in 3 abusers ever spend a single day in jail. But up until now, change has been slow and scattered. Aisha's law, named in honor of Aisha Fraser, has actually passed the Ohio House not once, but twice. Yet it's never made it all the way into law. Why? Because parts of the bill sparked pushback from prosecutors and criminal defense attorneys who disagreed with certain sections. As a result, both times it reached the Ohio Senate, it stalled. No vote, no law, no protection. Meanwhile, the threat to domestic violence victims hasn't slowed down, and survivors, they're still waiting for the system to catch up. Coming back to the man who once wore the robe of dignity and honor, the one who decided the fate of others. Now his own fate rests in the hands of a parole board. Lance Mason, the former Cuyahoga County judge, once trusted to uphold justice, is now serving a life sentence for the brutal murder of his ex-wife. But here's the twist that's left many stunned. He could one day walk free. After admitting to stabbing Aisha to death in front of their children, Mason was handed a life sentence. Yet it came with a caveat. He'll be eligible for parole in 35 years. That means at the age of 87, if he ever reaches it, the man who shattered a family and forever altered the lives of 2 young girls could make a case for his freedom. It's a painful reality for those who knew and loved Aisha. A respected teacher, a devoted mother, and a victim of unthinkable violence. Just 4 years before the murder, Mason had already served a shockingly brief sentence for violently attacking her in front of their children. He vowed then that he would never return to prison, but he did. And this time, he's not leaving, at least not for 35 years. For many, the idea of parole feels like a second betrayal, because some crimes, they say, deserve no second chances. Story 6. Como Nodwe. One of the most haunted homes in the world. Supposed to be me, because I'm the one that got convicted of killing my family. Supposed to be possessed by the devil. Over the years, we've seen plenty of horror movies inspired by true crime. Whether it's The Conjuring or The Exorcist, these films have captured massive attention. But today, we're diving into a chilling case that often slips under the radar. While some may debate whether these stories are exaggerated, there's no denying that the Amityville murders were once a terrifying reality for the DeFeo and Lutz families. And just like always, we're going to dive deep into every chilling detail of this case, uncovering the terrifying events that continued even after the murders. But to truly understand it all, let's first get to know the DeFeo family, who once lived in the house at 112 Ocean Avenue in Amityville, Long Island, New York. Ronald Joseph DeFeo Sr., or more commonly known as Big Ronnie, was born on November 16, 1930, to parents Rocco and Antoinette DeFeo. When he was younger, Big Ronnie was slender, handsome, and had a powerful gaze reminiscent of the legendary Rudolph Valentino. With his suave looks, he attracted the attention of Louise Marie Briganti, born on November 3, 1931, to Michael and Angela Briganti. Louise had aspirations of becoming a model. She was beautiful enough to mingle with the best, including the famous singer Mel Torme. After a brief courtship, Big Ronnie and Louise married. The Brigadiers disapproved of Big Ronnie cutting all ties with the newlyweds until September 26, 1951, when their son Ronald Joseph DeFeo Jr. was born. He would later be known as Butch, and for this video, we'll be referring to him by that name. Growing up, Butch DeFeo faced many struggles. As the firstborn son, his father expected a lot from him, and Big Ronnie was not afraid to discipline Butch in harsh ways. One minute, he would hug his son, and the next he would throw him across the room. Louise's brother, Michael Brigani Jr., would later testify at the DeFeo trial about an incident he witnessed when Butch was only 2 years old. He recalled as a child, Butch was extremely overweight, a problem that would persist until his late teenage years when he began using amphetamines. His school life suffered as a result, with bigger kids often teasing him, calling him names like the Blob, Bucky Beaver, and Pork Chop. Butch was not an only child for long. On July 29, 1956, gave birth to a daughter, Dawn Teresa DeFeo. A few years later, on August 16, 1961, Louise gave birth to Allison Louise DeFeo, and then again on September 4, 1962, to Mark Gregory DeFeo. Sometime after Mark's birth, Louise decided to leave her husband for reasons that remain unclear. To win her back, Big Ronnie decided to express his love in a unique way. He co-wrote a song titled The Real Thing, which jazz legend Joe Williams recorded in 1963 for his album One Is a Lonesome Number. On October 24, 1965, Big Ronnie was blessed with a third son, John Matthew DeFeo. By this time, the family had moved from their Brooklyn apartment to a lavish home on the South Shore of Long Island in the affluent community of Amityville. Many wondered how Big Ronnie, working as a car dealer's service manager, could afford such a luxurious home. The answer was clear. His father-in-law, Michael Bergani Sr., in the early 1970s. Big Ronnie decided he wanted life-size portraits to immortalize his family. Once again, Michael Bergani Sr. picked up the tab, which was estimated to be at least $5,000. The portraits, painstakingly detailed, took over a year to complete. When finished, they hung in large golden frames on the staircase wall between the first and second floors of the DeFeo home. By this point, Butch had become increasingly troublesome as he got older. The DeFeos owned an auto body shop where Butch worked, but he spent more time at bars than actually working. His growing addiction to drugs and alcohol only made things worse, driving him to violence against his own family. There was even an incident where he pulled a gun on his father, and countless other times where he lashed out physically at those closest to him. Then, in the early hours of November 13, 1974, Butch completely snapped. Armed with a rifle, he moved silently through the house, murdering his family members one by one as they slept. What's truly chilling about this is that despite the brutal killings taking place within just 15 minutes, the bodies showed no signs of struggle. Even more bizarre, the sound of gunshots didn't wake any of the other family members, or at least didn't rouse them from their beds. The bodies were found all face down on their beds, almost as if they had been carefully placed that way. To add to the eerie nature of the crime, the rifle had no silencer. Yet aside from the family dog barking, none of the neighbors reported hearing a single gunshot that night. After committing the horrific murders, Butch calmly took a bath, got dressed for work, and then reported the crime, claiming he discovered the gruesome scene after returning home. He even went so far as to suggest that a mafia hitman, Louis Fellini, along with 2 accomplices, was responsible. However, a police interview soon revealed serious inconsistencies in his story. The next day, Butch admitted to carrying out the murders himself. Fellini, the supposed hitman, had an airtight alibi, proving he was out of state at the time of the killings. Under the pressure, Theo confessed, saying, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop. It went so fast." He went on to explain how he took a bath, changed his clothes, and carefully disposed of key evidence, his blood-stained clothes, the Marlin rifle, and cartridges, before going to work like nothing had happened. It was claimed that Butch had been hearing voices that urged him to commit the murders. However, the prosecution brought in a psychiatrist who disagreed, diagnosing Butch with antisocial personality disorder. According to the psychiatrist, Butch wasn't hearing voices or possessed by another personality. He simply didn't see anything wrong with killing his family. Because of that, Theo was convicted on 6 counts of murder and sentenced to 6 consecutive life terms, which he continued to serve at the Sullivan Correctional Facility in New York until he died on March 12. There remains a theory that a second killer was involved, but that person was never apprehended. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every week, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Just over a year after the tragic deaths of the DeFeo family, the home on Ocean Boulevard was sold to the Lutz family, who would soon unknowingly step into a new chapter of horror, with the Amityville home marked by its horrific past. It's impossible not to wonder if the tragic events left behind some lingering, eerie energy haunting the land where it all unfolded. But the Lutz family wouldn't have to wonder for long. They would soon share their own unsettling experiences in the home, and they weren't the kind of stories you'd expect from a typical housewarming. Although the price was a bit higher than their budget of $3,000 of $5,000 something, about the house pulled them in. It was a beautiful colonial-style home, with 6 bedrooms, a heated pool, and a boathouse sitting right on the Amityville River. Now don't think for a second that the Lutz family wasn't aware of the horrific murders that had taken place there. In fact, they knew all about the house's dark past. But despite that, the Lutzes fell in love with the property and decided it was meant to be theirs. They bought the house for a bargain price of $8,000, never once thinking it was unlivable because of its tragic history. But what was supposed to be their dream home soon turned into a waking nightmare. The strange and terrifying events that followed were later shared with the world by author Jay Anson in his famous book, The Amityville Horror. Before moving into the house, George Lutz was a successful businessman, but after settling in, something changed. He became sluggish, cold, and irritable. Most bizarre of all, he started waking up at 3:15 in the morning every night, unable to get back to sleep. It wasn't just random, it was the exact time the DeFeo murders had occurred. One night, George was startled to see his 5-year-old daughter Missy standing by her bedroom window. But what sent chills down his spine was the eerie outline of a pig's face, with glowing red eyes, staring at him from behind her. He rushed into her room, only to find Missy sound asleep, as if nothing had happened. Not long after, Missy started talking about a new friend, an imaginary pig named Jody. But was Jody really imaginary? In another bone-chilling moment, George looked at his wife Kathy as she lay sleeping, but something was horribly wrong. Her face had distorted and aged as if she'd become a 90-year-old woman overnight. At times, Kathy seemed to undergo strange transformations, aging rapidly and looking like someone else entirely. Her mother even witnessed this unnatural change firsthand. But the strange events didn't stop there. The house seemed to have a mind of its own. Doors were ripped off their hinges, and in the middle of a freezing winter, a room was suddenly filled with flies. Outside, cloven hoof prints appeared in the snow right near their doorstep. Inside, green slime started to ooze down the walls, and then in the basement, they discovered a hidden room that didn't appear on any of the house's original blueprints. The room was painted a deep, unsettling red, and was only large enough for 2 people to sit close together. But what was even more disturbing was the faint, rancid odor that lingered in the room, adding to the overwhelming sense of dread that hung in the air. George even tried bringing their family dog into the mysterious basement room, but the animal refused to step inside. The usually brave dog backed away, tail tucked, and whimpered in fear. It was the only time George had ever seen the dog so terrified, as if it sensed something lurking in the shadows, something invisible to human eyes, but deeply unsettling to an animal's instincts. The eerie experiences didn't stop there. One night, George was jolted awake by the unmistakable sound of a band playing downstairs. The lively music echoed through the house, as if an invisible group was holding a late-night gathering. Confused and unnerved, he made his way to the living room to investigate. But the moment he stepped inside, everything went silent. No music, no people, nothing. Yet something had definitely been there. The rug had been rolled up, and the furniture had been shifted as if a dance floor had been cleared for a ghostly celebration. Desperate for help, the Lutz family reached out to a priest, hoping for some kind of blessing or relief from the terrifying events. However, the moment the priest stepped into the house, things took a dark turn. He was overwhelmed by a sudden intense sickness and began to experience his own set of unexplained disturbances. Some force seemed to be warning him to stay away. The impact of these events reached far beyond the Lutz family. Author J. Anson, who would later write the Amityville Horror, recalled how meeting the priest convinced him that this was more than just a story. It was real, because it was corroboration. Anson later said, "This was actually happening to someone. This was not The Exorcist or The Omen." From there, I started to create the book. On January 14, 1976, after just 28 days of living in what they thought would be their dream home, the Lutz family experienced a night so terrifying that they made a split-second decision. They packed a few bags, left everything else behind, and fled, never to return. They didn't leave with the intention of never coming back. According to a 2005 interview with George Lutz, he emphasized that their departure wasn't planned. "We didn't wake up that morning thinking we were leaving for good. This was our home. When we left, we didn't know we wouldn't be coming back. We didn't know that everything we left behind, we would never see again." Their abandoned belongings, untouched and frozen in time, were later set to be auctioned off, as noted in a Washington Post article from 1979. The house that had once seemed like a fresh start had turned into something they could never return to. Determined to share their horrifying experience, the Lutz family recounted every chilling detail to writer J. Anson, who would go on to transform their story into the instant bestseller, The Amityville Horror, in 1977. The book gripped the public, with the Los Angeles Times calling it both fascinating and frightening. But some critics believed its success wasn't just about ghosts and haunted houses. They argued that the story resonated with people because of the unstable political and economic climate in the United States at the time. Rampant inflation, rising interest rates, and a crippling oil shortage had left the country anxious and uneasy. As the story unfolds, it becomes clear that the horrors inside the Amityville house weren't the only ones haunting the Lutz family. Their business was struggling due to the failing economy. And at the worst possible time, the IRS launched an investigation into their taxes. For many readers in the late 70s, this felt all too real, paranormal or not. Financial stress and uncertainty were things they knew all too well. By blending supernatural terror with real-life struggles, the Amityville horror struck a nerve with the American public. It wasn't just a ghost story. It was a reflection of the fears people were living with every day. Some critics even argued that the book cleverly capitalized on popular horror trends of the time. The trope of a once loving father turning violent and unrecognizable as seen in The Shining. A priest reluctantly pulled into a supernatural battle reminiscent of The Exorcist. The grotesque imagery of excessive vomiting also a signature of The Exorcist. Even the eerie small-town coastal setting echoed the atmosphere of Jaws. When asked if he had experienced anything strange while writing the book, author Jay Anson quickly dismissed the idea. "Leave it? No," he replied. However, he did suffer a heart attack soon after finishing it, though he insisted it was due to his smoking and idiot lifestyle rather than anything paranormal. But while Anson shrugged off any supernatural connection, eerie incidents followed those who got too close to the story. Several people who handled early copies of the manuscript reportedly had near-fatal or fatal encounters. One of Anson's friends had a fire break out in his car while driving the manuscript back to the publisher. Another friend and his son nearly drowned when their car plunged into the water. But when rescuers opened the trunk, the manuscript inside was mysteriously dry, despite only being stored in a simple clasped envelope. And the most chilling case, a woman who had been given the first 2 chapters to read, died in a house fire the very night she received them. And among the charred remains of the home, the pages of the manuscript were found completely untouched. The terrifying tale of the Lutz family has since been adapted into several films, with the most famous being the 1979 version starring James Brolin. And in 2005, the Amityville horror returned to the big screen, with Ryan Reynolds stepping into the role of George Lutz, following in the footsteps of James Brolin from the original 1979 film. Both movies stayed true to the eerie backstory of the infamous house where a gruesome mass murder had taken place. But they each took creative liberties to crank up the terror. One major addition? A babysitter character who never appeared in the book. In the 1979 film, she watches the kids while George and Kathy attend a wedding. In the 2005 remake, the couple is simply on a night out. But according to the book, the whole family actually went to the wedding together. Then there's how the house itself is portrayed. The older film leans into the idea that the house is a sinister entity influencing Ronald DeFeo Jr. kill his family in 1974. Meanwhile, the remake shifts the horror to the ghosts of the victims, making them the primary source of terror. The priest who tried to help the Lutz family also gets different fates depending on the version. In the book, he hears a voice commanding him to get out, and later becomes ill, eventually giving up on helping the family. The films, however, escalate the horror, showing him being attacked by swarms of supernatural flies and even going blind. While the 2005 versions took the most creative liberties, the 1979 film also made key changes, sometimes stripping important moments of their original context. But regardless of these differences, one chilling fact remains. An entire family was murdered in that house. Yet, despite the Lutz family's claims of paranormal experiences in 1975, no other owners have reported hauntings since. According to the Washington Post and real estate firm Coldwell Banker, Harbor Light, 4 different families have lived in the house after the Lutz. A previous owner even had the address changed to avoid unwanted attention. The last time the house went up for sale was in the summer of 2016, and it was sold in February 2017 for just over 6,500 fall. As for the real murders that took place while Butch was eventually found dead in his prison cell, there are countless versions of events and interviews he held before his death. In an interview from 1986, Butch claimed his sister Dawn killed their father, and that their mother killed his siblings before he killed her. He later filed a motion in 1990 stating that Dawn and an unknown assailant were the real killers and he only shot Dawn by accident during a struggle. Despite his shifting stories, his claims were always met with skepticism. In 2000, he spoke with author Rick Osuna, asserting that his parents plotted to kill him, which led him to join forces with Dawn and others in desperation. Butch's narrative continued to evolve, with inconsistent details about the events and unreliable witnesses. His claims, including involvement from his wife Geraldine Gates, only deepened the mystery, with authorities and experts disproving many of his assertions. Now, if you're not a fan of paranormal activities, it's easy to lean toward the idea that Butch was simply a psychopath driven by childhood trauma or addiction, who saw no problem in killing his family. But if the lingering souls of his victims did haunt the Lutz family, we can only hope they've found justice and peace.